Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the Master of Science in Bioethics at St. Thomas University, and this particular course on bioethical issues at the beginning of human life. Today's lecture on contraception and non-therapeutic sterilization, otherwise known also as direct sterilization. We begin, as always, with a little prayer in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Blessed Trinity, we love you, we adore you, and we thank you for your many blessings, for the gift of life, and for having us here once again today. We pray that you inspire us, Lord, to discern your will in our lives and to discern also your teachings with regards to these bioethical issues at the beginning of human life, and very specifically with regards to artificial contraception and direct sterilization. Be always our guide and guide us, guide all the students and teachers throughout the world as we are still at the beginning of this new year, a new year of grace and hope, that your truth and your light and your life may shine on this earth abundantly. We pray, as always, for those who are in most need of your divine mercy at this time. In the name of Christ, our Lord. Amen. Okay, so today we have, just for the record, briefly, one student present here so far, okay, and I'm just taking the opportunity to mention that there are 9 students enrolled in this program, but everyone has a busy life, and so these students are also responsible, and everyone decides whether they can make it to the class or not, to the actual lecture live. Physically here, so that's also why I record these lectures, because whether they're physically present or not, you can always watch the YouTube, okay? And in fact, someone is logging in right now remotely. Morning, Elisa, good to see you.
Hi, good morning.
Welcome, great, we can hear you too.
Awesome.
All right, so just to reiterate the 3 modes of participating in these lectures, either live physically at the classroom in St. Thomas University, or live remotely, connecting through the professional video conference service. Or the third option is to watch the YouTube as the lecture ends at noon. I download it and make a YouTube and post it. So several other students have either texted or called in that they're on their way, but there's traffic and so forth. So anyway, I'm starting, so that way we don't run late at the end, okay? Today's lecture on contraception and non-therapeutic sterilization. Certainly it's a delicate topic in our society today and for many years, for decades now, because of what has been established in general as what is known as a contraceptive mentality, which I'll talk about, all right? And again, a delicate topic that we need to get into, because that's what bioethicists do. We jump right into the fray, and we love controversial topics. If the topic is non-controversial, then it's not a bioethical topic, all right? Okay, so just as a summary, if you will, for today, I'm going to be talking about human sexual intercourse and the 2 dimensions of sexual intimacy. I'm also going to talk about contraception and direct sterilization in a more scientific way or technical way of describing what goes on. Then the bioethical analysis of that. We're also going to touch on the principle of double effect, which we need in order to look at 2 phenomena that occur in nature, ectopic pregnancies, and also what to do with a woman who is pregnant and develops cancer of the uterus or some other organ of the reproductive system. And then after the break, actually, I'll do a little brief history of the contraceptive pill, which started here in the United States, essentially the first half of last century. So without further ado, let's move forward into looking at human sexual intercourse, all this issue of contraception and sterilization obviously has to do with the fact that we are capable of reproducing, of procreating, okay? And so we need to look at the act of intercourse, of sexual intercourse, in a human way, And that means that this act of sexual intercourse is unique in many different ways for the human. But at least specifically at these three levels, at the physical level, at the psychological level, and even at the spiritual level. Just as a little anecdote, when I was studying my doctorate at Purdue, and the doctorate in genetics, one of the courses that I took there at the graduate level was Sex and Evolution. And of course, the title is very appealing, right? And the professor for a whole semester lectured on sex and evolution, or rather the evolution of sex, right, in nature. And he kept going on and on about non-human sex, all right, how evolution developed, how sex developed in nature over a long period of time. In other words, this jump from asexual reproduction to sexual reproduction, where we have gametes and haploidy and all these issues that we've talked about earlier in this course, all right? And all of us students, we were about 20 students in there more or less, myself included, were waiting when he would get to the human part of the evolution of sex, right? And we kept waiting and waiting and waiting. And finally, the last lecture, the last day, at the end of the last lecture, he mentioned, well, you know that human sexuality is very, very complex and has very dimensions. One of those dimensions is the physiological dimension, but there are other dimensions to human sexuality and sexual intercourse. And because it is so complex and it is so unique, himself being a married man with children, he says, therefore, I'm not covering that in this lecture because this is about just the evolution of sex in nature. Okay, so he left it at that. At any rate, I'm going to pick up basically where he left off, more or less, and get into the other dimensions of human sexuality, which are physical, psychological, and spiritual. And this is what I mean. When we look at the sexual intercourse in humans, what do we see? That even at the physical level, it is unique. At least 2 or 3 details. For example, the first detail, we are basically the only species that has intercourse face-to-face, okay? Face-to-face. Other animals in nature that reproduce sexually, all right, where intercourse is also involved, because you know that sexual reproduction does not need intercourse necessarily. For example, in fish, all right, in fish that reproduce sexually, the female lays the eggs on the floor of the ocean or the lake or wherever it is, or the stream. And then the male lays out, as it were, the sperm, the semen, which is called smelt, I believe, in fish. And then that sperm has to wiggle around through the water to fertilize the eggs that are there, okay? So in fish, even though they reproduce sexually, there is no intercourse as such. Except there are a few fish who do have intercourse. Some of the aquarium fish, for example, the guppies and the mollies and the swordfish, all right, the male has what is called a gonopodium, which is capable of injecting actually some sperm or directing some sperm into the female. So there is an internal fertilization there, but it's rather rare. And what I'm trying to say is that in nature, a number of animals that reproduce sexually don't necessarily need to have intercourse. And certainly in plants, there is no intercourse, even though many plants do reproduce sexually. But of the animals that do have intercourse, it happens, for example, in insects, all right? It happens also in mammals. It happens in birds, okay, that there is intercourse. Reptiles. None of them actually face each other, the male and the female, at the act of intercourse, all right? Typically, what is known is that the male mounts the female, and then they proceed with the process and the business, as you will, of reproduction. And it is strictly precisely for reproductive purposes. One exception to this in mammals could be the marine mammals, which generally do face each other for intercourse. We're talking about dolphins, whales, right? But even that facing each other, there is no embrace as such, because they really don't have, their limbs are limited. The forward limbs are the fins, and the hind limbs, in other words, what we call the legs of other mammals, are degenerate, and all that's left in the marine mammals, all that's left of the hind legs, the legs or the hind limbs, is actually just a rudimentary pelvis, okay? But there are no legs as such in marine mammals. So even though they do face each other for the actual physical intercourse, there is no real embrace as such. Okay. Really, as far as we know, in the animal world, in nature, the only animal species that embraces face-to-face for intercourse is the human. Okay? That I find very interesting, and also unique in that literally the faces can see each other. All right. Now I go back into what I had talked about, the face, the countenance, the prosopon, all right, which simultaneously reveals and conceals our feelings, our emotions, our sentiments, and our thoughts. So in that sexual act of intercourse, the couple are literally expressing to each other what they're feeling, okay, just by the mere expression of their face. And so that's at the physiological level, which is very unique to the human species. Beyond that, there is also still at the, well, going into the psychological aspect, the human female is the only one who can naturally accept the male outside of ovulation, outside of being in a stage of fertility, okay, in her time of fertility. This is also unique in the natural world, and we see that typically in nature, the male and female only copulate when the female is ovulating or is going to ovulate. I know that in some insects, for example, the male actually deposits the sperm, the semen, in a bag that's inside the female, and then the female, her organs, her reproductive organs, will take from that bag and fertilize her eggs. Okay, so there are unique systems that occur, particularly in the insect world and other arthropods. But in looking more closer to us, to our species in mammals, typically the female mammal will only accept being mounted by the male when she is estrous. In other words, when she is ovulating, right? The rest of the time, she will not accept the male for copulation, to the point that the male, because the male is always producing testosterone, all right, 24/7, then in principle, the male is ready, if you will, to copulate and to mount the female. And that is precisely what we call sexual maturity, when the male of any, let's stick with mammals for now, when mammals become adults. The definition of an adult in nature is precisely when they're capable of reproducing, all right? So an adult male means that that male is already producing a sperm. and also the testosterone that is exciting the male toward copulation. Well, because the female is cycling, then the female will only accept being mounted, like I say, when she is ovulating, when she is estrous. And she will accept the male then. When she's not ovulating, she will definitely not accept being mounted, okay? And you can take the case of lions or tigers, for example, where the male lion will be tracing the female, and actually a harem, because again, the typical thing in mammals is a harem situation where the male will have several females, and the females will be ovulating at different times so that the male is able to mount different females throughout the time period of each cycle, you see. And that's just, again, you think about it in evolution, it is edging in favor of reproduction, in favor of getting some offspring from some female that will be viable and will survive, okay? Because again, in principle, natural selection is acting all the time. And then the weaker ones will be selected out. Also keep in mind that due to the process of internal gestation basically means pregnancy, all right? Then typically mammals are reduced to having fewer offspring at a time. Unlike fish, for example, where the female lays out hundreds or even thousands of eggs at a time, in mammals, the number of pregnancy, the number of offspring in each pregnancy is limited to maybe a dozen or so in some mammals, to just one, like in the human, typically, all right? So again, concentrating a little bit on when the female accepts the male in the mammalian system, of which we are a part. I was just following the example of a lion who is following his lionesses, the lionesses who are in his cohort, in his harem, and he will be typically smelling wherever the female urinates or makes a marking, because he is literally smelling the estrogen level, okay, the hormonal level of the female, to see when that hormonal level is high enough to trigger him, to let him know that she is becoming estrous, and she will allow him to mount her. Okay, these are the terms that are used in science and for the mammalian system, for sexual reproduction. All right, so if the lion tries to mount a lioness outside of estrus, because again, the lion is constantly in heat, if you will, is constantly producing testosterone, she will simply turn around and kill that lion, okay? She will be totally aggressive to him, so that mounting a female outside of estrus is a definite no-no. And that's why the lion keeps his distance as he is smelling the urine samples of the female, okay, of the lioness. And her behavior changes 180 degrees when she's actually ovulating, to the point that she will just settle down quietly and assume the mounting position so that the male can mount her. But it will definitely be from behind, you see, so there's no face-to-face. All right, so you can see that that is strictly business. In other words, it will be strictly for reproduction, for generating a new generation, precisely, a new generation, okay? There are some exceptions, and the one exception that is quoted all the time is the chimpanzees, because it turns out that observation has noted that female chimpanzees will accept the male outside of estrus, all right? And what's going on in there? Again, that is an adaptive behavior that has occurred, because it has been further noted. First of all, we need to know that chimpanzees in general are very aggressive. They're very aggressive animals, okay, in nature. And so, and the male in particular. And when he's producing testosterone all the time, even more so. So a mature male, a sexually mature male, is a very aggressive animal. All right, what happens? The males will force the female into mounting. Okay, so essentially that would be the equivalent of raping the females if they had a conscience like we do. And so the females have figured out that by allowing herself to be mounted by the male outside of estrus, they get less beaten. They get less abused, physically by biting. I don't know if you've ever seen the teeth, the canines of a chimpanzee, but in general, the canines of, let's see, chimpanzee, let's put smile so that you can see some canines, or better yet, yawn. What we're talking about is that they have pretty impressive teeth. And here you go. Those are the canines. And so the canine teeth, which are meant for sinking into flesh of their victims. And they will use those teeth also to intimidate the females. Okay. And therefore, the female has figured out that if she allows herself to be mounted outside of estrus, it does two things. She gets less aggressed by the male, to the point of drawing blood and so forth, painful for the female. And also at the same time, it turns out that drains the male. With an ejaculation, it drains the male of testosterone. So the next few days, whatever, that male will be calmed down and toned down, okay? So this is what actually happens in the animal world, and specifically with chimpanzees. And so the fact that the female chimpanzee allows the male to mount her outside of estrus, well, we'll have to qualify why that happens. It's not the same as a woman accepting a man to engage in intercourse, in sexual intercourse, outside of ovulation, willingly, let's assume on both parts, okay? Very, very different scenario. So that's another example of why human sexual intercourse is also unique at the psychological level. Beyond that, the spiritual level, of course, is that this sexual intercourse is very, very powerful, extremely powerful. And it's simply not just a connection of two bodies, all right? But there is a whole investment that occurs in that action from both parts. But typically, if we look at it just at face value, the investment is much greater on the part of the woman because she's literally accepting whatever the man brings. Okay, physically, psychologically, and spiritual. And therefore, there's also a spiritual dimension to the human intercourse that truly is unique. Well, first of all, we are the only ones who have a soul as the human soul, which, as we defined, has an origin that has no end as such, in that we're called to live eternally, and that is unique in the animal world or the plant world, in that we believe that no other animal or plant or living thing has a human soul as us, all right? So ideally, when there is human sexual intercourse, the human soul is also involved in that intercourse, all right? So it's not just at the physical, physiological level. It's not just about the business, say, of generating, of reproducing, of generating a new offspring, okay, a new generation. All right, so hopefully this has been sufficient to convince you that human sexual intercourse is unique in many different ways, all right? And again, because this is bioethics, it's evidence-based, I've given you some basis for this uniqueness. All right, so how is human sexual intercourse unique? Well, it's what we call the two dimensions of human sexual intercourse, all right? The two dimensions of intercourse, which are the unitive and the procreative dimension. I've already talked about this earlier a little bit, but now I'm going to go a little deeper into it. and invite you to consider this, that the unitive dimension of the intercourse is the bonding that happens between the couple. Now, a number of you are married people. Some of you are actually preparing for marriage. The rest of us, some of us have decided not to marry willingly because we chose priestly vocation, all right? But I want to say this, and I want you to tap into your married experience. And for us who are priests, I just want to say that we don't have wives, but for lack of one wife, we have many, many wives, okay, and many husbands. In other words, over the years and decades of confessions and spiritual direction, I'm sure Father Joseph and I have heard a lot of experiences of married couples who come to us to talk to us. In fact, many times they tell us what they don't tell their spouses, right? So even though it's vicarious, Father Joseph and I know a lot about marriage, okay? In fact, in certain aspects, we may know even more about marriage than some married couples because their experience, hopefully, is only between themselves. But our vicarious experience of marriage is over decades of many, many people, many couples who come to us. At any rate, there is the unitive dimension is the bonding that should occur, that does occur when the couple truly lives their intimacy, their marriage in a truly loving and giving way, okay, in a generous way. And so there is a mutual expression of their love. And there is a universal call to love. In fact, we will be judged on that according to the teachings of our Lord Jesus. All right, so the highest capacity of the human precisely is the capacity to love. Now, the marital love is unique. Is unique and is expressed precisely in what crystallizes, if you will, what is emblematic of the marital love is that sexual intimacy, okay? Which is not only physical, but also, like I'm proposing, psychological and spiritual. But even if we start just with the physical, that has a lot of implications. For example, the first implication is that married love, the love between spouses, okay, the intimacy, the sexual intimacy between spouses is a naked love. It's a naked love. All right. So again, I'm talking about normal people. Whenever I give examples or statements or try to base, say what we call evidence-based, is I'm talking about normal people, okay? The majority of people. The majority of people normally don't walk out into the public naked. That's a normal thing, right? And we talked about nakedness, and we talked about the development of clothing in the last course, precisely to as perhaps an indirect evidence of when we became human as such, when we started covering our bodies and specifically the sexual organs, all right? So there is the natural shame that comes with being naked in public, and therefore clothing, and therefore also the whole development of the fashion industry, which again is a multi-billion-dollar industry. But my point is that true marital love is naked love. In other words, the only time when we feel it's okay to bare our bodies totally is with our spouses, right? And that again is the natural, and that's the way it should be. It should be that way, but not in public. So of all the love that we have with other people, including relatives and friends and so forth, the only one that really eases our conscience in being naked is that marital love, is that love, that intimacy with my spouse. And why? Because there's so much risk. There is really so much risk in bearing our bodies. When we bear our bodies, we are in a sense bearing also our souls, okay? Otherwise, why would it be so shameful to walk around naked? Why? Question that. Why would it be so shameful, especially when it's warm and nice outside, for example, right? And in fact, we get close to nakedness, when we go to the beach, for example, and we are in a setting that is kind of okay. But even there, the bare minimum for decency is precisely to cover our sexual organs. Okay, and so why is that? Why is that? Whereas in the bedroom, it is okay to be totally naked, precisely because there is a lot of risk in that exposure, right? And one way or another, the soul, the conscience, is also being exposed. It's also being exposed, and so it calls for a lifelong commitment. Lifelong commitment in this sense. Again, evidence-based. Think about this. What is the intuition for a married couple, okay, who have been married for X number of years, and they have their ups and downs, as everybody does, because, you know, a married couple is two minds, and two minds don't always think alike and feel alike, etc. But they work it out, and they live, and they're faithful and loyal to one another. And then, all of a sudden, one of them is not. One of the spouses is unfaithful. If and when the other spouse finds out, what is the natural, normal sense? That other spouse, the betrayed spouse, is certainly not happy and joyful about that. It's a deep sense of betrayal that has happened, a deep sense of betrayal. And why? Because precisely they have been working toward forming this life project together, and there was an invested trust in the spouse, in the intimacy, precisely in bearing their bodies and in bearing their souls together. There has been an investment of trust, which has been betrayed specifically by bearing the guilty party, all right? The guilty spouse has bared his or her body to a third person who is not a member of that party, is not a member of that marriage. And even if it's just a physical bearing, in other words, even if it was, let's say, with a prostitute, either male or female, all right, which was just strictly physical, let's say, for the pleasure of it, that still causes a deep sense of betrayal, even just at the physiological level. That's telling us that the nakedness of a man and a woman belong only to each other for life. This is before any consideration of the faith teachings of our Lord and so forth. Even at the natural level, just by the human emotions that occur when there is a betrayal of that couple. Even, in fact, I would, make the case for even a couple who is not even married. Let's say they're not married in the church, they're not Catholic, they're not married civilly, they just believe in living together. You know, the expectation of that living together is that there's going to be fidelity. That's the natural, normal expectation. And we have to be honest with ourselves that that is deep-seated in our human nature, kind of hardwired. All right? Okay, so that is pointing out to the fact, the real fact, that the intimacy between a married couple or between any couple is an exclusive intimacy. It's mutual and exclusive between them and no one else. And that is pointing out that the intimacy is not only physical, but also spiritual, okay? In other words, the sealing of these two souls together in a lifelong project. Again, evidence-based, consider the daily experiences that couples go through. Not when they're apart, when they're working or doing the home chores or whatever, all right, or shopping, but when they are together. Typically, what do they do at the end of the day? Well, it's natural for the couple to talk about what happened during that day. And why would they feel the need to share what happened to each other and to listen what happened to the other? Because, again, it's a lifelong project. It's building that lifelong project together, which is natural and it's normal. And to talk about those experiences and, in a sense, almost subconscious, the longing of not having that experience together, of the separate experience. You know, oh, honey, you wouldn't believe what happened to me today. What is that telling us? Deep down subconsciously is that the spouse wanted the other spouse to be with him or her when that stuff happened, whatever it was, whether good or bad or, you know, exciting or depressing, whatever it happened during that day, that spouse longed for the other spouse to be with him or her, to share that experience together. So even if they go to the same experience but separately, there's that longing. And why is there that longing? Because it's pointing to the fact that this intimacy, this human sexual intimacy, is not just at the physical level, but also at the spiritual level. Okay? All right. So moving forward, this spiritual intercourse begins to form a life project together. And this is, in the end, what we call this unitive significance of the marriage. It is a new reality that doesn't happen even if those two individuals went through the same experiences, but separately and not together as a marriage or as a couple. All right? At the end of the day, what we have is two bodies and two souls who surrender to one another. And guess what? Just to complement it, we have a biblical passage that precisely affirms that. Again, now tapping into our Judeo-Christian tradition. And the book of Genesis, chapter 2, verses 24 and 25. If you recall, we use, oh, really? We use, I guess we have to spell it out for, we have to spell it out for those who are not versed in biblical notation. Okay, so here we're back to our old interlinear that we used back in the previous course, right? Whichever translation you want. Let's see if it gives us the actual Hebrew. Oh, I know, I have to put interlinear there. Let me see. Just to be consistent with last semester's sources. Interlinear. Okay. He gave us, I remember the Hebrew? And it goes to, well, I needed 2 and 25. One more. Let me see if this does it. Maybe just Genesis 2. Sorry, folks, what I'm trying to do is to get 24 and 25 together because you'll see that there's a connection to what I'll be talking about. So let me back up one more here. Come on, there we go. 24, 25. If there's a will, there's a way. Oh, okay. You win. That's all. Let's look at, remember, when we looked at the physiological, the phylogenetic origin of the human and human species, and we combined the evidence, the anthropological evidence of the fossil record and so forth, with the biblical, being that we are, this is according to the Judeo-Christian tradition. And we saw the passage, Genesis 2, which describes that second type of creation, the second description of the creation of the human, right? It says toward the end of that chapter 2, God states to Adam and Eve, for that reason a man shall leave his father and mother and cling to his wife and form one flesh, all right? And form one flesh. So it's a reference directly to the human sexual intercourse in its fullness. And you see this quoted many times precisely at weddings and so forth. But what's interesting is that the chapter, that the verse that follows this one, which is 25, right? If it's here, no, here. Look at the comment that the sacred writer says about Adam and Eve when they received this instruction and this clarification from God. Remember that we read backwards, right? So we start here, we read from right to left. And they were both naked, the man and his wife, and not they were ashamed. So we put this into normal English. Adam and Eve were naked and not ashamed, right? They felt no shame. They felt no shame. This is Genesis 2. What happens is Genesis 3? Well, the fall, the forbidden fruit, all that. And then as a consequence of that, at the end of Genesis 3, what is it? Precisely because they were naked, they felt shame, right? And so Adam says to God, when God, Yahweh, is looking for him in the garden, okay, in a very symbolic language, I hid myself because I was naked and I was ashamed. All right? So we see that passage. So this nakedness of body and soul is very significant of our origins as a species as a whole. And therefore, it's also significant of each individual as the marriage seeks to go back to the origin, how God intended us to be, of the creation of man and woman. So marriage, sacramental marriage specifically, is very rich in that sense, and that it seeks to take us to the origin of innocence and purity and immortality, of the love, the marital love, the love between a man and a woman for life. Henry? Yes?
From a theological perspective, this specific verse will reveal the first stage of nature.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Integral.
Exactly. How God intended us to be as a species as a whole.
And then right when we go to the next one will be the second one, right? Because
yes. What we call the fallen state or the
state.
post-lapsarian state. The lapsus means the fall, right? The post-lapsarian state is our current state. And in fact, we have evidence of that because when we look at the rest of nature, which truly lives in innocence, not because of any fault of their own or lack of fault, simply because they don't have a rational conscience, we see that no other animal dresses. All other animals are going around naked, showing their reproductive organs all the time, and none of them get scandalized. Them, right? And so there is, if you will, a reflection of the original state of innocence, how God intended all of creation to be, and when we look outside the window, at the rest of nature. But because of our rational conscience and our will, our capacity to go against the will of God. That's another thing too. That's why the rest of nature lives essentially by instinct, because they are literally incapable of going against God's will. So they cannot fall into sin. And that's why we don't put animals into prison when they kill each other. when again, a lion takes down a zebra, we don't put that lion in jail, in prison for killing a zebra, all right? Or when a zebra eats the grass, we don't put the zebra in prison for eating the grass, for killing the grass, right? But we do put humans into prison when we kill each other without justification, like in not just aggressor without self-defense. Not in the case of self-defense. Okay, John?
You said marriage takes us back to innocence, childhood, and purity? Or did you say?
To innocence, purity, and even the gift of eternal life, which was, the preternatural gifts. Yeah. Innocence, purity, immortality were at least the three gifts that we consider they're called preternatural gifts. They were the gifts that God gave Adam and Eve before the fall, and how he intended us. This goes back to Genesis 1. We were created in his image and likeness, male and female, so he defines the two genders there, the two sexes, but especially in the image of God. So we image God in our innocence, purity, and immortality.
Back when you mentioned that lions want to be face-to-face.
Correct.
What about chimpanzees?
Okay, the reason for the chimpanzees for sometimes the female accept the male out of estrus is so that to basically save her life or her health because of the aggression of the male. Okay, but they don't really, and I think in zoos, some chimpanzees have developed the capacity to mate face-to-face, all right? But you have to keep in mind that the zoo is an artificial setting. And also in zoos, again, speaking from the biological perspective, it has been noted that some primates will also masturbate, which generally doesn't happen in nature. Okay, so, but it has to do with the enclosed environment that somehow is affecting their psyche. And they're also great imitators because remember, mammals, primates, we are tremendous imitators. We mimic. The baby will mimic the parent, whatever they see the parent do. All right, and chimpanzees are great imitators. And so who knows, if they're exposed to human behavior, they will mimic that human behavior. You know? Conceivably, even kissing and so forth, because they're imitators. And then that also stimulates certain hormones and on the pleasure centers of the brain that will reinforce that kind of behavior. So that can all be explained at the psychological level. You know. Okay, so back to over here, wherever I was. Yes, the bottom line about this this life project of two bodies and two souls coming together, right, for a life project in a very unique way that doesn't happen, that doesn't really work in a commune situation, for example, or in a polygamous situation of the mammalian system, because typically the polygamy is going to be a polygyny, right? In other words, several women for one man. Is not generally polyandry, in other words, one woman with several men, all right? And so there is an intrinsic injustice built in to a polygamic system of the human, in that the several females have to share the one male. You know, several women have to share this life project with the one man. So there's an intrinsic injustice built in that project there, all right? Okay. Okay, so bottom line, it flows from this unitive significance, or the unitive dimension, flows naturally a procreative significance also, in that naturally this couple that is building this life project together naturally would desire for this life project to be passed on. See? And it flows from the sexual act of intercourse that, guess what? It happens to be also a fertile intercourse. In other words, it has that other dimension naturally, which is fertilization, okay? And again, humans at that level were not exempt from what happens in nature there, okay? Human sexual intercourse may be unique, but it's not outside of the natural realm, in the sense that if there is a fertile ovum and there is fertile sperm, well, chances are that that ovum is going to get fertilized because it's a natural process. So in a sense, this procreative significance naturally flows out of the unitive significance, all right? Number one. Number two, psychologically, guess what? Naturally, when does the wife naturally, on average, desire her husband more in the sexual intimacy? When she's ovulating. Because again, the estrogen is higher and there's a stimulation, okay? So there's a natural desire during ovulation on the woman's side, precisely because she's cycling according to nature, whereas the man is not cycling, and therefore that brings a certain tension between the man and the woman, between the husband and the wife, all right? But also as a safety net, if you will, precisely the capacity of the woman to accept the man, the wife, to accept the husband outside of her ovulation, which also has the added benefit of draining the testosterone and so forth, okay? But again, being able to fulfill the life project together, okay, without getting pregnant because she's not ovulating. And I'll pick up on that more for sure when we talk about NFP, natural family planning, next Saturday. So let's move a little bit back. I'm going back and forth into these three dimensions, right? The physical, the psychological, and the spiritual, seeking to integrate it precisely in the human, because we are unique again that way, in that we can precisely integrate those three dimensions, beyond anything that nature can do, non-human nature. So going back to the mammalian system of which we belong, we realize that naturally intercourse may lead to fertilization, right? As long as the sex cells, the gametes, are mature and capable, et cetera, et cetera. But because there is that other psychological, but even spiritual dimension involved, at the end of the day, we say that truly we don't reproduce like the rest of nature does. We procreate, see? So truly, so already there's a problem, and it's significant and it's emblematic. How the whole industry at the secular level, the whole industry of infertility and in vitro fertilization and all this, they talk about reproductive. They talk about reproductive assistance. They talk about reproductive rights, okay? And precisely they're focusing on that reproductive aspect of our nature, which is the same as the non-human. In other words, at the end of the day, reproductive means at the cellular level that one needs a fertile ovum and a fertile sperm of the same species in the proper place, right? In locus, which would be the ampulla for mammals. And it's emblematic. I find it very, very telling, because they're focusing on the human person as an animal as opposed to procreative, as opposed to as a human. I'm talking about the secular industry of reproduction and sexuality, how sexuality is handled by society at large, in a secular way of the reproductive issue, to either enhance it or to suppress it, right?
Could it be that the secular world doesn't see the human being with the soul?
Yeah, it's truly human. Or if they say, right, exactly, that's the whole point, that it may be conscious or subconscious, right? And let's give him the benefit of the doubt that it is subconscious. Really, what we have is a reductive vision of the human person. One way or another, because they fail to see the human soul in the human, they're making that human less human. They're not seeing the human as who we fully are, as we really are. In fact, again, going back to in vitro, since we studied in some level of detail, it's very much mechanical. It's all about the technology. It's all about procuring the eggs. It's all about procuring the sperm and doing the magic in the lab, okay? It's all about the technology, a very horizontal, mechanistic way. And where are these humans? To the point that the industry does not pass judgment on whether they're buying the sperm, they're buying the eggs, they're using a third party for the pregnancy, they're single, married, whatever orientation they happen to have, etc. All they need, all the industry needs is the cash on hand. And we move forward. And that's the reality, okay? All right, so very much so. The human soul is so subtle that it can pass undetected, right? And we just look like animals who are wearing clothing. How strange for these animals to wear clothing. Okay, so the inseparable aspect is not the actual begetting, it's not the actual procreating, it's not the actual fertilization, but the desire, the natural desire for procreating, okay? The natural desire for having children, in other words. In the global picture of the marriage, the natural desire for children in the marriage. In fact, at least from the Catholic perspective, for a couple, an engaged couple, to be married in the church, they need to desire to have children. If they really don't desire to have children, okay, either him or her or both, we cannot perform that marriage. That marriage intrinsically is not a valid marriage. It's not a sacramental marriage because it's one of the three goods, what we call the three goods of marriage, all right? The three goods of marriage is the unitive, in other words, fidelity, indissolubility, and progeny, right? Fidelity, I spoke about in length, is the desire that is mutual and exclusive between the two of them and no one else. That's the fidelity. Indissolubility, meaning that it is a project for life. Okay, if I'm going to surrender my naked body to you and you're going to do the same, and in that we're also surrendering our naked souls to one another, which in a sense is even more intimidating, right? Okay, then for this to really work and to throw in the towel for in good times and in bad, in sickness and in health, then it has to be until death do us part. Okay, so indissolubility. But the third dimension, naturally, is that this couple desires to have children. If the children actually come or not, then that's a whole different scenario. Because they may or may not come because they are preventing it, or because of any number of reasons, or simply because they can't have children. Again, back to the physiological level, and they didn't know about it because they didn't experiment before they married. And they were not pregnant, or they did not impregnate before marriage. So whether the children actually happen or not is not really up to the couple. It's up to God as creator, right? And so it also, you see, by being co-creators, by procreating, and by being open to that progeny, we are also opening to God. And to God as God. In other words, if God is God, it has to be creator and so forth, right? So God really knows for every couple in the world, if and when they're going to have children and how they're going to have children and so on and so forth. And also, even further, God knows who he wants the couple to have children with. And so we're going more and more toward what we call the vocation. So we accept that if God is who he is, then he has to be the creator of life, and specifically human life, in his image and so forth. We see that there's a lot at stake. There's a lot that has been put into this human act of sexual intercourse. Okay? In other words, truly, ideally, naturally, and even from the perspective of the faith, it should involve the whole person, the two person, fully engaged. All right. Now, enter contraception and sterilization into the picture. Before I go there, questions, comments? All right.
You know, we talked about natural selection.
Yes.
And in animals, there seems to be a more natural selection of who the father is going to be of the offspring.
Yes.
Especially in the case of the lion.
Yes.
Because the stronger lion defeats the weaker lion.
Exactly.
Has to run away.
What is known typically the alpha male in mammals in general, right? The alpha male establishes territory.
I don't think my wife, for instance, was looking for natural selection.
For the alpha male. Very good. So who is the alpha male in the human?
So even at the choice level, so to speak, there is really no natural selection in human beings.
No, there is. Right? Yeah. Well, but you think about it, okay, don't fall into the trap that natural selection in the human is only at the physiological level, or even at the psychological level. Yes. Because nature, what is human nature for us? Yeah. We're not just a body. Yeah. We're body and soul one, right? That's substantial unity. Right. All right? So from that angle, and for the sake of the clarity for the rest of us, what Lincoln Lewis is pointing out actually is that natural selection also is at work in the human, but in a much more complex way. Okay, because, and also that's another aspect of, thank you, that's another unique aspect. I can include also one there, maybe a sub one of the psychological, at the social level. Many species, who is the one that selects? Yeah. Typically it's the female, the choice. The female selects, in other words, the female at the end of the day, at the individual act of that intercourse, is the female that either gives in or not, right? So it's a female that's selecting, and she's selecting on the traits on the male. All right? So you can have a harem situation and still the female select. For example, take the peacock, which again is so a clear example. You have the peacock, who is the alpha male of his harem, and then he has the peahens. But there'll be several peahens. In fact, the other day I was driving around through Coconut Grove with some friends, just slowly looking at the neighborhood, and there's a neighborhood there that's very interesting because, first of all, it has hills. One of the very few areas of natural hills in Miami. Okay, when we get into the next course, I'll talk about the ecology of Miami, how it was originally, and how essentially the Everglades ran all the way to the shoreline. And they were natural cascades, they were natural waterfalls in Miami back then, small but real, and I can even show you the evidence, before civilization got here, which is only a little over a century ago. But anyway, going through that area, there's some natural hills there, and some houses that are also unique. It's kind of a bohemian area. It's kind of the hippie area of the Grove. There was one house that the roof is made out of thatch, palms, and so forth. And on top of that roof was a little clan, I don't know what the proper name is, for a peacock, all right? A flock, thank you. There was a little flock of peacocks, and the peacock was here, very proud, neck sticking up, surveying the horizon constantly. And then he had all his peahens there, about 3 or 4 of them, all on top of this roof, all right? And the peahens were pecking away, and the peacock was up watching, protecting, was just looking at it, the photograph. I wish I'd taken a photograph because it was very telling that what was going on there, the dynamics. But he had several females, but he could only mount one at a time. Okay, so you know that those females, that little cohort that he had, was selecting on him, on this particular male, all right? And they all decided, one, for whatever reason, you know, instinctive reasons, they decided that they will allow themselves, this is the male they wanted, okay? And they lock into that flock. They lock into that little cohort, all right? So these are his females, and he will defend them. And that is their male, and they will defend him too in their territory. Interesting, okay? The dynamics that occur there. I don't know why I was saying that. Oh, in the male, in the human then, we really select each other, okay? The female is selecting, the woman is selecting, definitely selecting on the male, all right? And, but the male is also selecting on the female. Otherwise, there would be no reason for the female to paint her face, for example, all right? And there will be no reason for the male also to groom himself. And dancing is emblematic of the mutual selection. Because dancing, which has been in humans since the very beginning, dancing around the fireplace with bells and whatnot, okay, in the primitive human, all the way to the sophisticated dances that we do today, is showing prowess, is showing some physical characteristics, all right, that they can hold a rhythm, they can move a rhythm, but it's also showing psychological, how they react to music and to a rhythm and so forth, okay? So, frankly, the gal and the guy who can dance are gonna hit it off better at the party than the ones who can't dance, or don't wanna dance, or are too shy or too proud to get up on the floor and do it, okay? Even if they hear the tune for the first time. So, to me, dancing in the humans is very emblematic of mutual selection, all right? And that is, again, another kind of unique characteristic of the human. So you see how we do bioethics, evidence-based, but always complemented with the image of God and the great joy and privilege that we have in bringing in the faith and seeing that, guess what? God's message, at least as read through the Judeo-Christian tradition, corroborates and illuminates and really gives meaning to what we observe in nature happening with the human. So contraception, what happens, artificial contraception and direct sterilization or non-therapeutic sterilization is going to go against, it's going to frustrate those two dimensions because it's going to go directly against the procreated dimension, but in an artificial way, okay? First, we need to define a little bit what we mean by contraception and sterilization. Again, I'm talking about artificial contraception and direct or non-therapeutic sterilization, okay? Which, as far as the function is concerned, they have essentially the same function, which is to render a fertile woman infertile. All right, so it is the intention that I'm looking at. Why the intention? Because whether the contraception actually works or not, again, depends on many, many factors. Take, for example, a woman who is on the pill, right? On an oral contraceptive, but she has breakthrough ovulation. Did she desire that breakthrough ovulation? No, that's a big danger, actually. She may not even know it because she's on the pill. And in fact, the pill is going to be 99% or 99.5% effective. Let's say that it's 99.9% effective. That means that 1 in 1,000 women will get pregnant taking the pill, as we say, religiously. In other words, being fully compliant with the medication, okay? And so what I'm trying to say is that the contraception and the sterilization is a mentality, it's a mindset to desire not to get pregnant. Just let's start with that for now, okay? Before passing a value judgment on it. It's a desire not to get pregnant. Then we have to engage in certain behavior and use certain things in order for that desire to be effective, okay? So I said from the previous arguments that I was presenting with regards to the unitive and procreative dimension of married life, that the normal standard default position is for the couple to desire children. So this contraception and sterilization goes against that natural desire, okay? However, for grave reasons, avoiding children may be the moral thing to do, the ethical thing to do, actually, okay? So it may be at a particular time in the life of this couple, it may be irresponsible for them to have children, all right? And what are some of those reasons? But they have to be serious or grave reasons. And they could be finances, for example. They're both starting college. They're in debt up to their ceiling, and but they didn't want to wait anymore, and they did get married. So they're married in college and studying and getting PhDs, and they're spending all their money there. And so for now, they have to wait, okay? Finances could be relocation also. They're moving to a foreign country, who knows what, where they're going to land, what kind of resources they'll have there, and so forth. So relocation could also be could be a serious reason for avoiding children. If they're really not mature enough, they're married, but they're not really ready to have children, right? Okay, that could be. My question there is, why did they marry in the first place? Because they just made the most serious commitment that they will make for the rest of their lives. But they did it anyway because they found a benevolent priest or deacon who married them. Okay. Medical reasons could be, right? Medical reasons, including, for example, older women, all right? Older women from 32 to 35 is a critical time for women. 32 to 35 years of age, on average, is when the eggs of women are definitely getting too old. And there will be more incidents of aneuploidy and chromosomal abnormalities, including chromosomes sticking together and not a complete, because remember, the women, they're born with a set number of eggs, number one, and number two, they are in arrested meiosis, right? They're halfway through the meiosis, but it has not finished to mature the eggs. That happens beginning with menarche at the first period and then continuing through her reproductive years, which, again, just for the sake of simplicity of numbers, let's say she has her first period at 10 years of age, menarche, and she has menopause at 40, so she had 30 years of window of fertility, right? 3 decades, we made a calculation that only requires 360 eggs to be fertile every month of her life for 30 years. At any rate, those eggs are getting older and older and older, the ones that do survive and not die and be reabsorbed. And so there's an increasing tendency of abnormalities as the egg finally matures, as ovulation happens, okay? And one of the abnormalities that these chromosomes tend to stick together, the spindle mechanism is defective in that second meiosis, and so sometimes the egg does mature, but is defective and gets fertilized. And guess what? The next thing is that there is an abnormal embryo fetus developing, okay? One who carries some abnormality. Most of those abnormalities, as we saw earlier, do not survive the pregnancy really, and typically they get discarded in the first couple of weeks of pregnancy or as the embryo is implanting and is discarded, again, a spontaneous abortion or a miscarriage. But some of them do make it through and end up being born with some kind of birth defect. The typical one is what? Down syndrome. That's the typical one. The typical birth defect that happens with old eggs is Down syndrome. Why? Because that's the one that tends to survive. In other words, in principle, what is Down syndrome? It's an extra chromosome, right? Chromosome 21. That's why it's also called trisomy. Tri meaning three, somy, a reference to the chromosome. Trisomy is a third chromosome, one extra than the pair, and it's typically trisomy 21. There are other trisomies that occur also, but typically they're not compatible with life. Why? Well, it happens, it has to do with size. The fact that trisomy 21 is chromosome 21, what is that telling you? You always want to, when we talk about science, we obsess about numbers, okay? So scientists, when you hear a number, a lot of things should go off in the mind. So what does chromosome 21 mean for the human? Out of how many chromosomes? 23. I'll tell you further detail to help you. Well, what is the 23rd chromosome? That's the sex chromosome, right? The other 22 are the autosomes, all right, which means that they are not involved in the sexual characteristics of the human body. You know, they form eyes, they form hands, brains, feet, liver, etc. Okay, I'll tell you another little hint to top it, is that when the human chromosomes were first numbered by the technique, what was the technique? Karyotyping, in other words, taking a photograph of the chromosomes in their chromosome stage, right, in their mitotic stage, an actual picture through the microscope, through a light microscope, and then printing that photograph and cutting out physically the chromosomes. Again, picture says 1,000 words. Karyotyping. All right, give me some images. Here we go. These are the human karyotypes. What I want to point out, let me see if I find one that is not as clean. And we'll see what I mean. It's hard to tell from these diagrams. Oh. Let's see. What is he looking for? I'm looking for the edge of the paper to show in one of these karyotypes. Let's see if it comes out. See, they clean out these photographs. Maybe this one. What I'm trying to show is that in some of these photographs, these are actual photographs of the chromosomes, physical photographs taken through a microscope and then printed on a paper, and then the paper is cut out. Each chromosome is cut out. And sometimes you actually see a contour of the paper. Okay, this one you can see a little bit from the pixelation. Look at this. You know pixelation? Why?
It's just with an ordinary light microscope.
Yes. High power, of course, it's immersion, but it's a light microscope. Where did it go? It's behind here somewhere. Move over, please. Oh. Give me a minute, maybe I can find one that is shows it better, because I've seen it before. What I'm looking for is the edge of the paper where they were cut out. All right, I keep tapping on the photograph. View image. You can't really tell. Sorry, I should find one at some point. But anyway, these chromosomes are cut out individually, all right, like that. And then they're put together by what? What determines their place? Well, especially the one through what determines their placing? 1 through 22. Oh, that's a good, yes, exactly, size. Just the physical size, okay? But look what happens between 22 and 23. I'm sorry, between 21 and 22. Which is bigger? Exactly, slightly bigger. Just physically, by the physical size. If you take the average of these two and the average of these two, it is evident that 22 is bigger. In other words, when the human chromosomes were first karyotyped, right? Which was a long time ago, decades ago, the resolution was not as precise as we have today. And whatever sample they were using for 21 and 22, 21 actually looked a little bigger, or 22 looked a little smaller than 21. So they were misplaced. They were simply misplaced. If it were strictly by size, 21 should be 22 and 22 should be 21. But because this has been done already standardized throughout the world for karyotyping, the numbering has not changed, and it is historical. That 22 in the human is actually a little bigger than 21. All right? All this to say, look at the Y chromosome. It happens to be what? Boy or girl, male or female? Yeah. There's the Y chromosome, which is slowly disappearing, by the way, over a long period of time.
What do you mean?
Slowly disappearing because it just carries basically, well, it carries the SRI gene, the one that makes maleness, that makes the testosterone specifically to differentiate the gonads into testes, all right, and the male reproductive organs. But it has few of any other gene or the sex-linked characteristics. And so it's being selected out. Remember, only 3% of any one of these, in principle, it has coding region, right? So the 97% can be discarded. It's like wagons in a train. You have 100 wagons, but only 3 wagons are carrying load. You can get rid of the other 97 wagons as far as the load is concerned. Okay, so anyway, 21 is physically the smallest. Also, it happens that 21 has fewer genes. It doesn't have to be, okay? It doesn't mean that chromosome 1 necessarily has more genes than chromosome 2 or 3, all right? Generally, in general, the larger the chromosome, the more genes, simply because there's more DNA in them, okay? That package has been allotted in a larger quantity, all right, generally, but not specific. Remember, we have to pack in here within these 23 pairs of chromosomes, or actually 23 chromosomes, right, in the haploid system. We have to package anywhere between 10 and 20,000 genes, which is what makes up the human genome. Okay. So in general, the larger the chromosome, the more genes it has, generally. It happens that 21 does correspond to having the fewer number of genes and being the smallest of the chromosomes. What does that mean functionally? That it codes for fewer amino acids, it codes for fewer proteins, so it is related to fewer functions of the body, okay, translated functionally. And it happens that the functions of the body, the genes that are in chromosome 21, can tolerate a third chromosome, can tolerate an overexpression. Again, functionally, what does it mean to have a trisomy, to have a third chromosome of any of these? It means that there's an overload of those particular genes. That's what it means functionally, right? In other words, that let's say that this gene, I don't actually know the specific genes in 21, we can look it up, but let's say it codes for the length of fingers, all right? You have a third chromosome, well, it's just going to make longer fingers. There's an overabundance of the particular proteins expressed there, okay? But certainly they're not going to be regulatory proteins, they're not going to be proteins that are in a critical amount, especially for early embryonic development, which is what determines the baby, and all the organs to be in place by the 8th week, by the 2nd month. So bottom line, in chromosome 21 in the human, there are very few genes, and those genes, when there's an overload, literally an overexpression of those genes, is still compatible with life. It's compatible with life. In other words, it's not fatal. In contrast with many of the other genes, if we have that same phenomenon with any of the other gene and any of the other chromosomes, the overload of genes, all right, the overexpression literally is fatal. In other words, it's not compatible with life. And typically, that little embryo will die from that overexpression early on. If you make it through, there's a trisomy 8 and so forth. So some chromosomes can tolerate a trisomy and still be viable. They tend to be severely abnormal, and they may not survive. They'll survive the pregnancy, but they may not survive like the first year of birth of life outside the womb and so forth, okay? Because there are many more insults that occur outside of the womb than in the womb. Okay, in the womb, they're really very, very protected. And so bottom line is that here, trisomy 21 has a series of characteristics, some of which are physical, some of which are psychological, and is what we call Down syndrome, okay? Which used to be called Mongolian, simply because of a reference to the slanted eyes in the Mongol people, which today we consider offensive, obviously, but that's one of the physiological characteristics. And they are ranges. They are ranges of this physiological and psychological characteristics, okay? And that's what we call a syndrome, okay? Which is a cluster of characteristics. And they can range from the very mild to the very severe, both at the physical and at the psychological level. So in one extreme, you could have a Down syndrome child who barely looks like the typical Down syndrome face, right? And is quite bright and intelligent and barely has any kind of mental disability. That's one extreme. The other extreme, the opposite, will be very characteristic of the Down syndrome, very pronounced, including the sticking of the tongue on top of the palate and so forth, physiologically, and also be severely mentally retarded, right? So you have those two ranges that can occur independently. You can have one that is physically severe and mentally minimal, and vice versa. Okay, so it's a very complex syndrome. The bottom line is that basically they are compatible with life, and they can make it through life, but what do they need? They need love. They need love and care because they are innocent, and they'll walk away with anyone who tells them, let's go, which can lead to abuse, especially on the women and so forth. So it's delicate. They have to be supervised 24/7. I have a second cousin, the daughter of a cousin of mine, of a niece of mine who is Down syndrome, Eliza, and she is the life of the party, and she is the soul of the family, and she has stolen everybody's heart you know, because she's so spontaneous and creative, and she loves to dance, and she loves to be the star of the gathering, and she's totally mainstreamed. I think she's going into high school next year, you know, and she's totally mainstream in a public school, which I'm sad to say has more resources for special needs than the Catholic schools. All right, and so we're fortunate that way, because not all Down syndrome children are that mild, okay? But she has to be supervised 24/7 because no one takes away her innocence, okay? That's locked in for life. And so it's a concern. On the other end of the spectrum, again, going back to prenatal diagnosis, with the 95% of the women who get a positive prenatal diagnosis for Down syndrome, meaning that they have identified by simple karyotyping, you know, they identify 23rd pair here. That's the simplest test to do today with prenatal diagnosis, is they abort, the vast majority of them abort. So really it is a selection, you know, is eugenics if you think about it, what is known as negative eugenics, trying to get rid of the deformed. And we have it historically now, it's happening that fewer and fewer Down syndrome children are being born. And it's not that women's old eggs are not getting old as much. That's a natural thing that is locked into our nature, okay? It's not that women's eggs are all of a sudden now becoming less old somehow by magic. No, still subject to the same decades of exposure and the same physiological phenomenon of non-disjunction, right? Is that they're being selected out. And they're being selected out mostly in the Northwestern Hemisphere, meaning North America and Europe, where prenatal diagnosis is available for women who are pregnant and so on and so forth. And then even the doctor has to recommend as one of the options, let's say I'm an OBGYN and I'm caring for a number, I have my patients, right? And a number of them are pregnant. And I have to, a standard to suggest certain levels, level 1, level 2, level 3 of pregnancy care as part of the pregnancy care to see if there's a history of non-disjunction or aneuploidy in the family. Just her age is sufficient to do some minor level of diagnostic techniques, you know, minimally blood sample, which could detect alpha fetoprotein or some other chemical that is coming from the baby that may indicate an abnormality. If that happens, then they can go level 2, a little more invasive. The doctor has to suggest because it's medically available. And if the doctor doesn't suggest these further analyses, he or she is suable for malpractice. Okay, so the doctor has to suggest another level of prenatal diagnosis like amniocentesis, taking out some of the fluid from the amniotic sac, which doesn't harm the baby significantly, but there's a small chance of inducing labor, so there's a minimal risk. It's considered invasive. But with a, what did I say? With amniocentesis, they can do a karyotyping because fetal cells are floating in the amniotic fluid. You know, the fetus is shedding skin all the time, and so there are fetal cells that are floating in the amniotic fluid of the baby. Okay, and so that fluid is taken out in the lab, manipulated to get to a karyotyping. And so from amnio, they can tell if the pregnancy is a Down syndrome child or not. Stop for a moment, question?
About how long along the process do they do that after?
So let's see, amnio is a little later because there has to be significant fluid there to accumulate and not puncture the baby. Of course, they do this with ultrasound, guiding the needle and so forth. So I'm going to guesstimate maybe about from the 8th week forward, more or less. All right. So it's about 2 months into the pregnancy.
They always do that for every baby?
No, only if there's an indication for it. So they first start with non-invasive diagnostics, right? And I don't know, Adriana, you want to say something about this, Andrea?
Yeah, I think 8 weeks or a little bit earlier, more or less around that time, they do a blood test.
Right.
To see, it depends on your age also.
Right. So first the age. The first indication is age.
If you're older than 34 or 35, I believe, then
that's automatic an indication.
It's, yeah, you're high risk.
Right.
So
in other words, I'm sorry, it means that clinically the doctor can prescribe that analysis, excuse me, and code it. In other words, he can get or she can get billed for it, all right, and get paid because it's a clinical indication, 34, 35. Okay.
And then for the regular pregnancy, they just do a blood test, and I tell you.
Make sure you're healthy, I guess.
I'm sorry?
Make sure you're healthy.
So in the blood test comes out a lot of stuff.
Yes. Also, I believe they do some DNA.
They can do from, right, remember that there's interaction through the placenta. Mother is feeding the baby, right? And so there's chemical substances passing through, but also the unborn child is interacting with the mother biochemically. So there's chemistry from the child that's passing into the mother, including cells. So they have found fetal cells floating around in the pregnant mom's blood. Okay.
But that blood test, they tell you that everything is normal, and then even if it's normal, on the second trimester, they do another test. And that is with also blood test but an ultrasound.
The ultrasound?
They count every single organ of the body of the baby. They check the heart, the chambers of the heart, also the legs, the arms, the fingers. They just want to know that everything. If something is
The
wrong,
morphology.
yes.
They can do that with ultrasound, which is considered non-invasive.
Yes, and they measure the size of the head, which is very important.
Right.
I remember every time I went for an ultrasound, they measured the head and it was fine.
Yes.
And then if there's an abnormality, they give you a few options, and one of them is just to abort.
Exactly. And the doctor has to suggest it. Regarding the head also, they measure something else. They get a ratio. It's called the head to tail ratio or something like that, which they measure the head and also the rest of the body to see if they are both in proportion for that stage, for the average stage of pregnancy at that time. All right. And so there's a lot.
Score.
Sorry?
Score.
That one's different. I'll look it up, but that one's a little different. I'm not.
I'll look it up.
Yeah, let's both look it up and we can bring it up next time. But so a lot of non-invasive diagnostics are done on the embryo, on the fetus today, right? But all those are indications for if anything pops up, if anything comes back. So the typical result is negative, meaning that there's nothing wrong for what they sampled or analyzed, okay? But if the result comes back positive, meaning that there is an abnormality, there's a deviation from the norm. Just like, you know, when you do blood tests and it comes back, the whole panel comes back and there's a range, and if we're outside the range, there'll be either a plus or a minus, meaning that we're higher or lower than the range, okay? And that happens with the typical one, for example, cholesterol and so forth. Okay, the same with the prenatal diagnosis. Well then, if there is a positive, then they do more invasive, and that would justify either an amniocentesis for karyotyping, or if it's early in the pregnancy, that typically is for historical reasons. In other words, if the woman, number one, is older than 32 or 35, and if she has a history of Down syndrome children in her family, either maternally or paternally, that may also be an indication for doing something earlier on that is invasive, which is called chorionic villi sampling. Chorionic villi sampling. Let me just punch it in for a moment so that it remains on the video, which is going earlier. And I think they can do this about, this thing's always in the way. I don't know where to put it. Sorry. Chorionic villi are, the chorion is part of the placenta, all right? And it's one of the layers of the placenta, and the villi are little hair-like structures. So by pulling out one of these hair-like structures, they can get a sample of the fetal tissue because the chorion, like the placenta, belongs mostly to the embryo. And there's a sample of fetal tissue there, or embryonic tissue. So chorionic, there it is, villus sampling. A villus is a hair-like structure. It's a little more invasive. It has a little higher risk of abortion for the mother. Here, maybe this one. Okay, so the first level is a sonogram, of course, and everything has to be guided. This is amniocentesis shown here. Oh, there it is. All right, good. This one gives us the age. Yeah,
Scary.
kind of scary. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
With the Villus you're going supposed to walk.
Yeah, exactly. You're going closer and through more layers. So again, ultrasound to determine the position of the baby and so forth, and amniotic fluid. All right, 14 to 16 weeks forward. Then here, it's also known as CVS, chorionic villus sampling. The villus is the hair-like structure, not actual hair, hair-like structures of the chorion. And this can be done earlier, typically transvaginally, okay? But it's also a risk because you're compromising the plug, the cervical plug that develops so that there's no contamination of the pregnancy and so forth, all right? You're compromising that plug, and there can be, there's some incidence of a premature abortion going into labor.
And why do we want to do that, CVS?
Okay, this is if the woman is at high risk. Again, keep in mind this is basically a secular mentality where abortion is legal. So based on that premise, now there is a type of lawsuit that is called wrongful birth. All right, wrongful birth lawsuit is if I am a pregnant mom and my child has some kind of deformity and the child is born with that deformity and my OBGYN never told me, all right, then that OBGYN is suable for the maintenance of the rest of the life of that child. So we're talking millions. And one single wrong birth lawsuit can wipe out the practice of an MD who has worked on that practice for decades, okay? Because we're talking about the maintenance of a child with deforms, with defects for the rest of his or her life. Yes.
So I have a question. I was just thinking about it. What about a Catholic doctor?
Yes.
Does he still have to propose or give the option of an abortion if the baby has defects?
By law, yes, unless he wants to risk a lawsuit, okay? So this is how it's handled. First of all, he or she establishes a fame, a notoriety, a reputation for being a pro-life OBGYN, okay? Being a pro-life. Now, he has to, so he'll do the different levels of protocol of diagnostics, thank you, the different levels of diagnostics, beginning with the standard first level blood sample and then second level ultrasound and so forth. They're still non-invasive. But when it gets to the third level here, which is there's some kind of invasiveness, all right, compromising the tissue of the mother, then he or she can claim a conscience, all right, a conscience exception, all right, appeal to conscience and say, I will do these tests as long as they're not used for procuring an abortion. So what is the benefit? In fact, the ERDs, the Ethical and Religious Directives, provide for prenatal diagnosis. It's one of the positives, let's say, as long as that information is not used for an abortion, okay? But it can be used for the good. For example, it could be used for the couple to prepare the eventuality of having a child with birth defects. And now it can even prepare for some clinical intervention, for doing medicine on the fetus, either chemical or mechanical. I'm talking about fetal surgery. The drastic one is when, so what is a typical fetal surgery? Fetal surgery, think about it. He's going into the womb and essentially repairing some abnormality of the fetus. A typical one is narrow tubes that drain the brain, and they accumulate, the fetus is accumulating excess fluid in the brain. That's called hydrocephaly, and they're born with a larger brain. Actually, the cranium is larger, but the brain itself is smaller, because as the fluid accumulates inside that cranium, it's pushing against the development of the brain and it's inhibiting the normal development of the brain. Okay, so paradoxically, hydrocephalic children are born with large heads but small brains full of fluid. Well, it's a relatively easy diagnostic to take care of, considering the increasing sophistication of today's biomedical interventions on the human fetus. And essentially what they do, the principle is to put little shunts, little tiny, almost microscopic, little tiny shunts inside at the base of the cranium. The foramen magnum is the first vertebrae of the head that rotates, to drain the fluid so that the fluid doesn't accumulate, and to correct that narrowness, okay, to expand it. There are little shunts. They can do little shunts on the heart also for the valves to function properly and so forth. And let me finish the story. What do? If this is detected with one of these more invasive levels of diagnostics, literally they will clamp the ovaries and excise the uterus, the pregnant uterus. They will take out the pregnant uterus, okay, under very sterile conditions, and clamp the tubes and clamp the vagina and everything else that needs to be clamped there so that the woman, the mother, doesn't bleed to death. And then they operate on the fetus outside the womb, inside the womb, outside the mother. Do whatever correction is necessary if it can be done, and then put the fetus back, put the womb back, and do the anastomosis, which is all the sewing of the arteries and veins back together, and put her back together and continue the pregnancy. There are very famous photographs. I'm going into this line here because it's very interesting and exciting. But now there are more of these photographs, but there's one. I wish I could reduce this. It's always in my way. I'm sorry. There's one that is very exciting photograph, which is the fetus sticking his hand out, or her hand out from the womb.
What's the name of that Republican candidate father that he ran for president?
Yes.
He's a doctor,
Mm-hmm.
a surgeon. He's retired.
Yes.
What's his name? He was one of the first ones.
Oh yes. Okay. Yes.
What's his name?
Oh, yeah.
Ben Carson.
Afro-American.
Yeah. What's his name?
Oh, yes. Yeah, he was one of the candidates for the Republican Party.
Right. He's one of the
Yes.
first ones to do this kind of surgery. In fact, I
Fantastic.
believe he's the first one. In the United States. Yes.
Ben Carson.
The one who was in charge of the
It's health, no.
Yeah.
Our housing.
houses
Housing.
department.
Yeah. What's his name?
Yes.
He's
Yes.
right before me.
Ben Carson.
Give us
Ben Carson.
again.
Ben Carson.
Carson. Ben Carson. Thank you,
Yes.
Carson. Ben Carson. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Benjamin Carson. Thank you very much. Yes.
That's a voice from the heavens.
Voice from above. Literally a voice from above. Okay.
Voice from the heavens.
So here you have fetal surgeries occurring today. Back in the early 90s, when I was writing my first dissertation, this was total science fiction, okay? And so my dissertation was on the fetus as a medical patient at the Gregorian in Rome. That was my dissertation, so I know a little bit about this from the research, but it's just fascinating what can be done
I
today.
think the first one he did was on the heart. It was on the baby's heart.
Was it?
The fetal heart.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
But the,
Yeah.
the should have done also like a heart surgery to try based on the baby.
Well, yeah, that's what I hear anecdotally. You know, I haven't researched it expansively, but yes, I think this was one of the first ones where they were getting ready to sew back the womb. They were done with whatever surgery they did. They were getting to sew back the womb, getting ready. And the fetus just pulled out the hand and grabbed onto the pinky, actually. So this is not the one because it grabbed onto the pinky of the surgeon.
I think
Okay.
that's even, I think he did this one. I think he did this one.
Yeah.
Yes, I think he surgeon who did this one.
This one in particular. Okay, yeah.
Well,
All right.
the kid with the heart.
Yes.
That stuck his hand.
So yeah, so now it's become popular, you know, now it's kind of become popular that they do this, okay, but the first one was just spontaneous. He was getting ready to sew that womb back together, or maybe it was a nurse, I don't know,
Yeah.
but the child just reached down and grabbed onto that pinky, okay, and of course, that photograph went viral. It was quite a few years ago already. Anyway, back to where we are here. We were talking about medical reasons. Okay, so one possible medical reason for avoiding pregnancy is older women, older brides. Okay, so buyer beware. If you're beyond 32 years of age, you're pushing the limits, and that's just a physiological reality. So from 32 forward, that's the lower.
35.
Well, so that's the upper limit. You know, it's just like they say, like the insurance for a car, right? The car insurance. So the brain does not end maturing. The human brain ends maturing or growing physically between 20 to 25 years of age. Okay? So that's the human brain ends growing physically between 20 to 25 years of age. When does the car insurance lower the rates? At 25, right? At 25, so they're using the upper limit of that physiological fact. All right. So another reason could be that they already have many other children. They just can't handle one more, all right? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All I want to say is that there are real, honest, mature, responsible reasons for avoiding children. How does this not go against the procreative dimension of intercourse, okay, of human intercourse? I'll pick that up a little bit more in detail when we talk about NFP next Saturday. But for now, I want to go a little further, before we take the break, a little further into the means of contraception, the various means of contraception. They're generally in three categories, all right? They can be either mechanical or chemical or surgical, or a combination of these. So for mechanical, the condoms, the sponges and caps, diaphragms, the IUD, which I mentioned also can be chemical because modern IUDs, I understand they also put spermicide, and they also put contraceptive material on the tips. All right, so it's trying to suppress ovulation, but because these contraceptives can still allow for breakthrough ovulation, which is statistically there, then they can also act as abortifacients. In other words, that they will prevent implantation after the fertilization has occurred. One of the agencies that does not accept this is the FDA, because the FDA is defining the IUD strictly as a contraceptive device, and they don't want to admit that it can also be abortifacient. And this is because of an ideological redefinition of fertilization. Listen to my words. Words are important and they're significant. This is an ideological redefinition of fertilization. Fertilization is complete at syngamy. These terms should be familiar to you. It happens in the rest of nature. In other words, when we have a zygote, by definition, that zygote is diploid, is no longer a fertilized egg, and so forth. It's diploid, and that's the beginning of development, of embryonic development for any species, animal or plant, that reproduces sexually. Okay? So at syngamy, with zygote fertilization, it's over, done, over. Definitely for that individual. Now, for species, for animals that have internal fertilization and have internal gestation, there is a further process of embryonic development in utero, inside the womb, where that little embryo needs to implant into the womb. Okay, and in the human, I'm saying that it is between 5 to 7 days after fertilization is implantation. In fact, by the time of implantation, we already have what? What embryo? The blastocyst. Okay, the blastocyst, which has already undergone first differentiation, first cellular differentiation, no longer pluripotent, it's pluripotent, etc. You know that drill. FDA is now saying that fertilization is not complete until implantation happens. And so if implantation doesn't happen, that is an incomplete fertilization. And there's absolutely zero, less than zero evidence for that in nature. So what is the alternative? It's just ideological. It's ideological because they don't want to call the IUD an abortifacient, and because they don't want to call the in vitro industry also abortifacient. Because if there's no implantation, then guess what? There's no completed fertilization, there's no full human being, there's no pregnancy, nobody's getting harmed, etc., 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 etc. You know, the lies multiply. At any rate, that's the truth, and that's how we stand. Chemicals, of course, it's a different type of hormones that influence, that are trying to suppress ovulation hormonally, chemically, okay? These can also be, they can be taken orally, or they can be injected, Navapro, whatever it's called, that can be injected under the skin, so thermal. There are also these patches that release, their time release, and can go on for a year. I think there's one they're trying out for 5 years, a 5-year patch, subnormal patch. Typically, it's on the woman, but now they're trying to come up with male contraceptives also that are chemical. Of course, the condom has been around for decades on the male. In fact, it goes back even centuries, using gut of sheep gut and animal guts and so forth, way back to immemorial times. These all have different levels of efficiency. Well, I'll talk about that in the next slide. But basically, we're looking at the different methods that are available: chemical, mechanical, surgical, either the vasectomy on men, which is essentially clamping the vas deferens, the tubes that go to the prostate to ejaculate, or the tubal ligation, the fallopian tubes on the woman. Also, a hysterectomy, or hysterectomy is removing actually the uterus of the woman, and or it may or may not include the ovaries. Sometimes only the uterus is removed and the ovaries are left to maintain the hormonal cycling of her body.
I learned a few days ago in a mom's group that is obviously not Catholic that tubal ligation is not 100% effective.
Absolutely.
In fact,
yes.
In fact, a lot of women have gotten pregnant even after. I learned because it was funny. This person thought that she was pregnant. She was saying it cannot be because I got this operation.
Got my tubes tight. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it cannot be, and everybody else started talking, and a lot of moms started saying, "Oh well, my 2-year-old was after a tubal ligation," and so there's, I believe, a 10% chance that you can get pregnant. So it's not 100%. Which is, I didn't know that. Still,
yes,
life
it's amazing.
Yeah.
Nature is pernicious and insistent, and will not give up. If they cut, they tie. But guess what?
So it heals itself out of it.
No, so we're talking about microscopic, right? So a microscopic sperm can still come out here and back in here. Talk about being potent, right? And being stubborn and determined. We know that men are very stubborn. And so if a sperm is meant to go through all this hassle and fertilize, that is going to be a very potent sperm. Okay?
Why would anybody do that to themselves?
Yes, to avoid children, to have sex without children. That's why. That's the bottom line. Why? Why would they do it? To have sex without children. Yeah.
It's probably easier to give up sex.
How would the egg get
It's easier, right?
over to the uterus then?
Exactly, and do the same. Exactly. So statistically, there is proof. 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10,000, 1 in 100,000, but it's happening. Okay.
The doctor show these pictures before the Xaviers agreed to this.
Mm-hmm. Just for the sake of, we're inclusive and we're an equal opportunity here for men and female. So we'll look at the vasectomy. This is essentially the same stuff going on.
And sperm production is still happening, right? And then,
Oh, absolutely,
but
sperm, because
it's never released. The sperm's never
correct. There's mature sperm here going into the epididymis, stored there, and then ejaculation pushed out, right, through the vas deferens, the tubes.
Doesn't it still keep making sperm even though the sperm aren't being released?
Absolutely. Testicles are doing their thing 24/7.
So does that harm the testicles at all?
So what happens? We don't blow up, right? What happens is reabsorption. Every 24 hours, on average, the sperm is being reabsorbed. Every minute, actually, old sperm is being reabsorbed. So unlike women, we are producing sperm all the time, and that sperm within 24 hours is considered old and is being reabsorbed all the time. Again, physiologically, remember that the sperm has very little cytoplasm, so it has to be maintained by the fluids and by the surrounding environment, okay? But it only finds a better environment, actually, in the female tract, where it can live up to 5 days. So sperm is better in the female tract than in the male tract. Sperm. Mm-hmm. So that's what they do, and sperm has figured out a way to bridge that gap. Yeah, statistically it's there, so it has to be, I don't think anyone has yet to photograph a sperm jumping this and then jumping the other one, A couple who has had a vasectomy and a tubal ligation and they still get pregnant. Okay, if there's a will, there's a way, right? There's a human will, but nature's will is even harder than ours. It's more hardwired. And so it does happen. Now, for the sake of completion, in theory, they are reversible. These ligations and vasectomies, in theory, they're reversible. But in practice, there are all kinds of considerations. Think about it. First of all, to anastomosize. Anastomosis is the sewing that has to occur almost microscopically to sew those little tiny tubes back together, okay? And to hope that inside no scars develop, because if there's scarring, then there's blockage, and then either the sperm, but most likely the egg is going to get caught, and it's going to cause an ectopic pregnancy, which we'll cover in a minute. All right, and so there's already physiological reasons for not reversing the sterilization, the surgical sterilization. And there's also psychological reasons. Well, it's going to cost you a few more $1,000. We don't know if it's covered by insurance or not. We don't know if it's going to work or not. Okay. And it's still going to be painful and so forth, and there's going to be a period of recovery. So existentially, what happens is that most couples who had the surgical sterilization do not reverse it. Okay. And so that's just the reality of human existence. Moving forward, look at some rates, again, statistics, and there's a little bit also, I have failed to say that next semester you're going to be taking a course in statistical methods. So it's important to become more and more familiar with numbers and to use them. Okay, what does this mean when we say 97 to 9% success, right? Let's take the upper end, 99% the pill, 99%. What does that mean existentially? For every 100 women who are taking the pill consistently, by the book, every day, at the same time of the day, and so forth, of every 100, one will get pregnant, statistically. One will get pregnant through what I've mentioned many times, is called breakthrough ovulation. In other words, there was a hormonal suppression, but there was an override of that suppression by this stubborn follicle that is going to erupt and mature no matter what. Okay? And so that's breakthrough. That's on the high end of the statistic. it also assumes, on the low end, is that 3 women out of every 100 is going to get pregnant, on average. If this 100 did not get pregnant, then 6 of the next 100 is going to get pregnant to maintain the average statistic, okay? And that's how statistics work. So really, when you think about it, it's not really all that effective when people think, when the woman thinks she is 100% not going to get pregnant, right? Okay. That also implies perfect use, all right? Very consistent, perfect use, which again, humanly speaking, existentially, is not always, oh, I forgot to take the pill today, I forgot to take it last night, I forgot to take it the day before, and that may have been the placebo pill that had no estrogen because she's outside of the cycle, but that may have been the high dosage one that was the one needed for suppressing the ovulation, okay? So again, when we go into the statistical, into the probabilistic world, we go by the numbers. We go by history. And because there are millions and millions of women throughout the world on the pill and on other contraceptives, these statistics are very solid, you know, because they're based on a huge cohort of sample. Aside from the risk, you know, you read that, take any, I was going to bring one contraceptive pill, the little package, the little pamphlet that has all the, how it's used, but more than that is all the contraindications, all right, and the side effects. It's a page like this, little tiny print like this, front and back, you almost need a magnifying glass to see it, okay? Why? Because pharmaceuticals, they don't want to get sued, and if the woman dies from a clot or whatever else, or heart attack, or, oh, we told you, here it is in the package, you know, but you took it at your own risk. But the contraindications are many, and they're all there. Side effects also are many, some mild, some drastic. It depends on every woman, and depends on her physiology, and so forth. At the end of the day, for all these contraindications, all right, the position of the Catholic Church against artificial contraception is not because of any of these indications. Why? Well, because theoretically, in an ideal situation, we could eventually develop the ideal contraceptive, whether physical or mechanical or chemical or surgical, that has no side effects, has no contraindications, is absolutely 100% clean and effective. Then, but it's still contraception, it's still an artificial contraception. Then how do we justify our position against it, you see? So even though these are serious, important considerations to take, especially for humanists, or people who are concerned for their health and their spouse's health, their wife's health, then we have to look at the other dimension of it, which again is more going back to the unitive and the procreative, which is that contraception, artificial contraception, and direct sterilization intend to block the procreative dimension. The actual intention is to block that procreation, okay? And so it goes against that dimension, which in principle should be held together at the level of desire. In other words, a woman taking the pill and doing it voluntarily, okay, and willingly, cannot at the same time will to get pregnant, because that's called schizophrenia, okay? And again, I'm using normal cases. So we either intend one thing or we intend another.
Yeah.
All right? And it's important for us not to do rationalization and mental gymnastics because we're also very good at doing that. You know, the first ones we deceive is ourselves. All right, so there is that radical separation between the unitive and the procreative, and whether consciously or not, we're really taking God out of that equation of being co-creators, right? Either God is in charge of this new life or not. And if we want to have absolute control, 100% control, then we're basically excluding God from the picture and from the equation, whether consciously or not. But that is, in effect, objectively, in reality, what is happening there, okay? We're not giving God his due, which is to be creator and to be supreme and to determine if and when and how new children, new images of himself come to this world, and for all eternity. What happens is that, again, existentially, in today's life, we seek control. And the more control we have, the more control we want, because it feels good to get into a car, turn it on, and then go. All right? We have to consider that there are logical and natural limits to our control. I would also love to fly. I wouldn't have to deal with the traffic, but I can't fly, not yet. We can use the artificial things for flying, but not naturally. So why? Because this is a natural event. This is a natural act, okay? And we're interfering artificially with a natural event that has been designed like this, one way or another, even through the laws of evolution by the creator of evolution, by God. Okay? So what is happening here is that with artificial contraception and direct sterilization, one way or another, the plan of God is being frustrated for this couple, which we're also holding that ultimately it is God who is calling that couple in what we call a vocation, all right? A vocation that is love-giving and life-giving simultaneously. Aside from that consideration, it is also bad medical practice. What do I mean by this? Well, because the first principle of nature, of medicine, is to do no harm, right? However, with artificial contraception and with direct sterilization, the intention is to make a healthy organ inoperative. In other words, it's to render inoperative, non-functional, a normal function of the woman, which is to ovulate, and to produce a mature ovum in the proper place in the ampulla of her reproductive tract. So again, looking at the normal, the standard, the average, the majority, that's what a woman's body is meant to be. And to have an intervention on an otherwise healthy reproductive system really is bad medicine. Is rendering inoperative a system, a reproductive system that is meant to be healthy, precisely because of its health. So again, if medicine were to be honest in this aspect, direct sterilizations and artificial contraception is bad medical practice. Different from therapeutic sterilization. Remember, I'll be saying direct or non-therapeutic sterilization. What is a therapeutic sterilization? Therapeutic sterilization is when it is necessary to save the health or the life of the mother, of the woman, okay? Whether she's pregnant or not. And so a therapeutic sterilization is medically indicated and is good medicine because now the woman has a pathology. Typically, the classical one is cancer. Cancer of the ovaries, cancer of the uterus, cancer of the cervix. And cancer is typically a life-threatening condition for the woman. So there's a direct intervention on an organ that has become pathological. Okay, and for the sake of that intervention, that is risking the mother's health or maybe her life significantly, then that medical intervention is justified whether she's pregnant or not. And the reason for doing that is what we call the principle of double effect, which I'm going to explain after the break, because I think you've tolerated enough of me for now. So let's take a few minutes of break here, and we'll come back to this point of the principle of double effect, okay? Questions, comments? No? We're good? Okay, let's take a break. Someone remind me to talk about the women's conference, please, which is precisely on women's health in 2 weeks, okay? Which we're also going to participate.
Sorry, I just read your email this morning, Father.
Yes?
Yes.
Okay.
I replied to it all week late.
Okay, folks, welcome back. Continuing here, we had left off essentially with the full analysis of artificial contraception and direct sterilization, that we will consider it offensive, really, going against these, the dual dimension of sexual intimacy in the human, and frustrating that sexual intimacy to be fully and truly human, okay? Which is the project of body and soul together. So I had also mentioned at the end that therapeutic sterilization is different in the sense that we have a pathology going on that is life-threatening to the mother or to the woman, whether she's pregnant or not, and therefore that does justify medical intervention if there is a medicine to heal her or to try to heal her, either chemically or mechanically, surgically. But that would have the side effect, if she is pregnant, that she'll probably lose her pregnancy, that the child will die, or if it's like, say, chemical, chemotherapy, radiotherapy, the child will suffer abnormalities likely from the medication itself, which is justifiable, I'm saying, by this principle of double effect. Okay, so let's look at double effect for a moment. And the principle of double effect is very useful in bioethics and in medical practice and in moral theology in general, because it allows us to engage in some acts that are, let's say, complicated. Some acts are complicated in that there are two effects of that act. This is ethically, morally speaking. There is a positive effect and there's a negative effect, or there's a good effect and a bad effect that flows simultaneously from the same act. Okay? Again, it's grounded specifically. The classical example is a woman who is pregnant and has cancer of the uterus. That's exactly where the pregnancy is. Well, there are two human beings here to be considered, the mom and the child, but it is the mom who has the pathology, and this pathology is life-threatening. So I'm saying to you that we can justify the excision of that uterus, taking out the uterus with the pregnant child inside, because that cancerous uterus, if we allow it to develop, most likely will kill the mother, okay? The process will kill the child too, but that's a separate consideration. The surgery itself, the hysterectomy that is involved in taking out the child, in taking out the cancerous uterus, is addressing a pathology. It's addressing a pathology. Follow me? Okay? If the wording gets you stuck, stop me, please, all right? So I'm trying to use the terminology that would be used in a setting like this. So we have two simultaneous effects from a single act. One is good and one is bad. It is justifiable as long as these 5 conditions are met. Typically, you hear about 4 conditions, but the 5th one is so obvious that many times it's not stated. In other words, the 5th one is really should be the first one. That is, it is the last resort. There's no other way of taking care of that cancerous uterus but to take out the pathological organ. All right? There's no other way. So this is the last resort. We know that the act, in order to meet double effect, right, to be justified by principle double effect, first of all, the act itself must be done for the good. At least the intention is to heal the mother, right? So let's stick specifically with this case of a pregnant mom with cancer of the uterus. What is the intent, the desire, the will of the doctor who is operating, the surgeon, is to take out a pathological, to excise a pathological organ, right? A cancerous organ, a cancerous uterus, which, by the way, has a lot of vascularity, and if that cancer progresses, most likely the mother will die. They have all died in previous cases when this happens. So the doctor is trying to heal a pathology. His intention, her intention is good, right? The doctor, that surgeon, cannot have as his or her intention to kill the embryo, to kill the fetus, which is going to happen if that uterus is excised. What happens to that cancerous uterus? Physically. Again, bioethics, we have to think very earthly. You know, we have to ground it. When a surgeon takes out a cancerous uterus, or a cancerous pancreas or a cancerous tumor in any part of the body, what happens physically to that cancerous tissue or organ?
It stops doing its function, or
Yeah.
it?
What is the fate of that tumor? Now it's outside the body on a tray in the operating room.
It gets stuck.
Puts into a biohazard bag and it goes into medical waste, which will likely be incinerated under sterile conditions so it doesn't contaminate anyone else. All right? So you understand that taking out a cancerous uterus that is pregnant, that uterus with the child inside, with the baby inside, with the embryo or fetus, is going to put it to medical waste and incinerate it. Okay? Now I'm telling you that that child is not going to be killed. That child is going to die. But it's not being killed intentionally. If the surgeon intends to kill that child, he has already vitiated, he has contaminated the act, and now the act only has one effect, which is a bad effect, which is to kill the child. It's not double effect.
So what do you do with the uterus with the child?
The cancerous uterus that has a fetus, a human fetus inside, goes into medical waste. That child will die. That child is not being killed directly. That child will die. Okay? Will die. But it's not being killed. And I cannot intervene. I cannot kill the child. I cannot go in and stop his heart, or euthanize. Cannot use, because now I'm euthanizing. I have to let the child die. The child will die for lack of support. In other words, the placenta will no longer get food. All right?
There will be suffering involved.
There will be pain. We don't know if they're suffering. There may be some pain for the child. Good question. So perhaps for an advanced fetus, maybe morphine would be indicated. So we can manage the potential pain of the child. We really don't know suffering, because pain and suffering are different. Pain is physical, suffering is psychological, and the medical profession many times doesn't make a distinction.
Should we bury this child and instead of?
It depends on the gestational age, on the progress. If the child's already a fetus, can be buried. If there's substantial tissue there and organs and an actual body to be buried, yes. So that can be claimed for cremation and burial. But if the pregnancy is early on, typically it goes to medical waste. And even later, the mother, the woman, can still decide to let the child go to medical waste. Okay?
Is this something that you could find early in the stage of pregnancy? I'm assuming, right? If you have,
it can be, yeah.
Most likely, yes.
Yeah.
It's not something that could develop after you're pregnant, or yes.
Either way, the cancer could have established before the pregnancy or during the pregnancy. And the diagnosis of the cancer, so the establishment of the cancer and the diagnosis of the cancer are two separate events.
So that means they could diagnose it like really
early on or very late.
Or very late. And
let's say a week before she's due. Tragic. But all of a sudden they discover that her uterus is cancerous the week before birth. Dramatic. The baby is fully formed. Oh, well. But then several lines.
And then do your trick.
Either induce abort, induce labor, or C-section. Now, which also points to viability. Thank you, because all the things are coming up. You see, that's what I mean by grounding. We look at the clinical setting. Viability today is around 23 weeks. 23. There was a baby that was taken out of her mom's womb at Baptist System here in Miami, okay, at 23 weeks of gestation. All right? 23 weeks.
That's really, really, really small.
Very small. That little fetus fits inside your hand. And she was, that's not the fetus. Thank you very much, Deacon Lewis. You know your anatomy. A human fetus. So let's look at 23 weeks. Okay. Yeah, but these are actually the Carnegie stages. These are not weeks of development. These are stages.
If maybe in the search, just put 23 weeks.
23 weeks, yes, thank you. Thank you. Okay. Oh, actually, okay. All right.
Oh my gosh.
She's fairly well developed. Okay, well, keep in mind after 8 weeks.
6 inches out
Yeah.
of 7 inches.
Yeah, about maybe half a foot. Okay, right. Okay, but you can tell that they are really essentially developed. It's just a question of size. Now the lungs are very tricky because the lungs need to develop a substance called surfactant. And surfactant is like a foam that allows the interchange. It keeps the alveoli moist and at the same time allow interchange with the environment, with an atmosphere, with gas environment, okay? And that surfactant develops late, very late. It's one of the last things to develop inside the lungs so that the baby can actually take her first breath. Because we don't breathe inside the womb, right? If we breathe inside the womb, we're going to be breathing amniotic fluid. In fact, there's some amniotic fluid that's going in and out of the lungs, for sure. But the lungs are basically collapsed before birth. And a very significant thing that happens to the lungs at birth is with the first breath, they're really taking that first breath for life, okay? And that's why they're put upside down or they're slapped and so forth. They take that first breath significantly large to expand the lungs for the first time, and that surfactant has to kick in and start the exchange, the gas exchange of absorbing oxygen and kicking out CO2 for the rest of our lives, for the next average of 8 decades, all right? But okay, so here's baby in the womb in proportion, size. Okay, but what I'm saying is that these babies are now being put into NICUs and ICUs, neonatal intensive care units, and some of them are surviving, okay, 23 weeks. It's only a matter of time. You know, we keep pushing the envelope further back and further back and further back, until eventually there could be, hypothetically, an artificial womb. In other words, for the whole 9 months. Okay. Eventually we could get there, but this is certainly pushing it. And you see that this baby has minimal intervention, IVs for sure, but mostly the lungs that can tolerate air. Mm-hmm. Okay, so you understand that the act itself, the intention of the agent, of the actor, has to be good, cannot intend the ill. But the ill effect is still there because it's a simultaneous effect of the act, all right? Now, the good effect also may obtains by good means, moral, ethical means. In other words, what is the proper means for intervening on a uterine cancer? Well, surgery. The woman has to put under anesthesia, it's major surgery, she has to get opened up and clamp all the vessels and so forth and do the surgical procedure that is correctly, properly indicated, all right? And so the means that are used are good means. Basically, the standard surgical procedure for removing tumors. Okay, this is reiterating a little bit the first principle, which is the evil effect must not be intended. Okay, it's not intended, but it's allowed, it's foreseen. We say foreseen but not desired. It is evident that if I take out a cancerous uterus who is that is pregnant, all right, the end result is that that fetus, if the fetus is not at viability, which not we can say that at 23 weeks, if it's before 23 weeks, the end result is that fetus is going to die. So I know it's lamentable and it's foreseeable, but it's not desired or intended. So you see, it's definitely at the level of intention. And where does the intention reside, by the way? We have objective and subjective. The intention relies at subjective, at the level of the subject, at the level of the agent, the actor. He or she does not desire, no one desires that embryo dies. Okay? It's just at the wrong place at the wrong time. So no one desires it, but it's going to happen.
But you know, Father, we live in a world where economics does play a part.
Yes.
So mom goes into the hospital, she's diagnosed with uterine cancer. She's 24 weeks.
Right. Yes. Good
Who's
medical
gonna
practice.
pick up the cost here of this?
Good medical practice should indicate to try to, if the fetus has reached viability, then good medical practice, what should be the standard medical procedure, is to try to put that child in an eco unit.
Okay, I understand this as good medical practice, but
Yeah.
do we have that practice?
Well, then it may depend on the insurance and who's going to pick it up, but the practice is there because it's been done, you know, and that child is alive today, and the parents are very happy that her child was saved. So it can be done, it has been done, there is evidence for it, and therefore the insurance can be petitioned for it, the Medicare can be petitioned for it, and so forth, right? Because there's already there's a precedent, clinical precedent of success at 23 weeks of age, okay? So certainly the doctors and the hospital can make a case for it. Yeah. So you're right, the economics does play in it, but we have to push for good medical practice, okay? And so the hospital can take care of that. Okay, finally, proportionality. Proportionality is very important, okay? Which is not to be confused with proportionalism, and I'll explain that in a minute. But basically, proportionality is that this intervention, this act that is just spelled out here with 3 little words, okay, the 3 little letters, is a very complicated act. It's loaded. It's a loaded act because it's an act that ethically, morally has 2 simultaneous effects. So that's already telling you it's a complicated act. The reasons for performing this act have to be serious reasons. It's not something frivolous. In other words, it's not for curing acne or something like that, all right? We're talking life for life here. In other words, if the pathology of the pregnant mom is not life-threatening, then this act cannot be performed because the fetus is certainly going to die. You see? So it has to be life for life. In other words, the progress of the cancer for the mother means death, spells death, right? And therefore, it is really life for life. And that's what we call proportionality. Proportionalism is an exaggeration. And typically the ism, all right, the ism makes it an exaggeration. What is proportionalism? That everything is measured proportionally. In other words, it would be equivalent to saying to collapsing the principle of double effect simply to the fourth principle. In other words, if there is proportionality, then none of the other 3 principles, premises have to stand. In other words, if it is proportional, the doctor can certainly intend to kill the child. In fact, the child, I'm going to euthanize the child before taking him or her out of the womb. See what I'm saying? Because of it's proportional. In other words, it is to save the life of the mother, whatever it costs. That is, proportionalism is an exaggeration, and we would measure everything proportionally. For example, a human, while in development, is not fully human. In other words, applying proportionalism, let's say, to embryonic stages, to the embryonic development, to pregnancy, would mean that a fetus who is not born is not fully human. Because why? Because they cannot breathe on their own, they cannot nourish on their own, okay? That's proportionalism. It's applying proportionality to everything in life. Everything is in stages. And it's very appealing to the mind. It's very appealing to reason, to say that a fetus is not fully human because it cannot breathe. It cannot feed itself, all right? But guess what? A newborn baby can certainly, a normal newborn baby can breathe by himself or herself, right? But he cannot feed himself. If I put a baby out on the street there, a newborn baby in the middle of the sidewalk, how long is that baby going to die? It's going to last? Not too long, All right. Oh, but he can breathe. Yeah, but he cannot care for himself at all. Someone has to feed him, so he's still dependent. When are we not dependent? I think we're not dependent when we're in the grave, right? We always at some stage of dependency, we're interdependent. And so proportionalism, even though it is very appealing, all right, at first blush, ultimately is a reductionism. It's not the full reality. It's a truncated reality. It's simplistic. It's not really covering. And you'd be surprised how many people in society function in a proportionalistic way. Or another spin-off of this is consequentialism. Consequentialism is that the ends justify the means. Okay? Because the ends are good, then the means can be evil. Bottom line. That's consequentialism, because the consequences, the ends, justify the means. And people operate that way all the time, subconsciously, but that's really the operative principles, the ethical, moral principles that are going on. And we stand rather unprincipled, that some things are intrinsically evil and may never be allowed, no matter how good the intention, the subjective intention may be. Okay? So you see, double effect is very useful in the medical practice, especially when you have these complicated cases. And two of those cases, the pregnant uterus I spoke about already, the pregnant cancerous uterus I spoke about. So to finish that story, it will allow for a hysterectomy, which is to remove the whole uterus. It's okay, right? That cures the pathology because the pathology is on the uterus itself. Not okay is to intervene on the fetus directly. So it's drastic, but it's real. Now, how about ectopic pregnancy? Because ectopic pregnancy is when the little embryo lodges himself or herself outside of the womb, specifically in the fallopian tube.
Which means the implantation takes place out of a...
Yes, attempted implantation, right? And then that's going to have drastic consequences. Okay. It's on survive. Okay. So let's look at exactly. I keep pressing the wrong button. There we go.
I feel like when it's an ectopic pregnancy, the baby starts growing, and of course there's no space.
Correct.
So it erupt, like
yes.
The fallopian tube. And
yes. Exactly.
Very painful.
Very painful, very serious, life-threatening.
Wow.
But you get the idea. It's kind of blurry, but you get the idea. First of all, it's a pregnancy. In other words, an egg has been fertilized. Now we got a zygote, which is going to go into a borla, which is going to go into a blastocyst and follow his or her development, right? But it's ectopic. Ectopic meaning it's outside of place, outside of the normal place, which you see here is a thickened uterus that has been prepared for implantation. Okay, the endometrium spongy and capable of receiving a pregnancy. The little blastocyst typically lodged himself or herself on the tube, gets stuck there, but getting stuck doesn't mean that development is arrested. Development continues. And the blastocyst that has that trophoblast, which is going to, the nature of the trophoblast is to invade the neighboring tissue. And what's the neighboring tissue? It's the fallopian tube. So the trophoblast of the blastocyst is going to attempt to establish a placenta in the fallopian tube. That's a big, huge warning signal. The fallopian tubes are not prepared to sustain a pregnancy. Okay, they're tubes. And so they're tiny, and barely the little blastocyst, who is microscopic, fits through there and is pushed by the villi, remember, down into his proper place, which is over here. So it's a very drastic situation. It is, like you say, very painful and also life-threatening, because as these capillaries start to establish, eventually they can perforate through the tube and go into the mother and cause a massive hemorrhage. Okay, because this area is very vascularized. Our reproductive organs, most organs are highly vascularized, meaning they have a lot of capillaries because they need a lot of blood flow to keep them functional for metabolism. So, bottom line, ectopic pregnancy is a life-threatening situation for the mother. All right? So we go to the principle of double effect. starting from the bottom up, okay, so there's an intervention of last resort. There is proportionality because it's life for life. The life of the mother is threatened. No evil is intended. How is no evil intended? This is what makes the difference between salpingectomy and salpingostomy. All right, these are intended to be tongue twisters for everybody. And there's a ethical difference between the two of them, whereby one is good and the other one is bad, morally, ethically speaking. All right, now, the classical is the salpingectomy. The salpingectomy means that the whole tube is excised. It's similar to tubal ligation. In fact, it involves a tubal ligation, or sometimes the anastomose. They cut the pregnant tube and take it out. Now, once you have an excised pregnant fallopian tube, where does that tube go to?
Waste.
Medical waste, okay? And in this case, we're talking macroscopic or very tiny, so there's no consideration necessarily of burying that, all right? But there is a human being there. Now, so the whole tube is excised and discarded properly. And one or two things, either the two ends are tied or reconnected by a process called anastomosis again, which is sewing it back together and hoping there's no scarring that develops there. But if this is an otherwise healthy woman, she's got another tube, right? Because these are paired organs. So the other tube in principle is healthy and she can still ovulate and get pregnant through the other tube. So her pregnancy is not compromised or her fertility is only compromised 50%, statistically in principle. So a salpingectomy does not fully sterilize the woman, sterilizes her partially or 50% on average, statistically, right? Okay, but there's no intervention on the unborn, and it's kind of paradoxical because the unborn is not being killed, it's left alone, but the embryo is gonna die because the embryo cannot survive inside the tube, all right? Different is going into the tube and making a little incision, opening the tube and scraping out the embryo, which medically at first blush again sounds less invasive and more benevolent for the mother because she gets to keep the tube and she could potentially be fully fertile again with 100% with both tubes. That is salpingostomy, okay?
And that is done like
nowadays? It's done a lot, and it's considered good practice, but it's not really ethical, morally acceptable. Why? Because it's a direct intervention of the embryo. It is actually killing the embryo. I cannot do a salpingostomy. If I'm the surgeon, I cannot do a salpingostomy without desiring to scrape out the embryo. And I cannot scrape out the embryo and desire for the embryo to survive at the same time because I'm not schizophrenic, okay? And so if I am scraping out the embryo, that very act of scraping out the embryo is desiring for the embryo not to survive, is desiring to kill the embryo.
Now I have a question. Let's say that I go to the doctor and he says, okay, you have an ectopic pregnancy.
That's your diagnosis, yes.
We're going to, the best thing and less invasive is to just remove the...
Right. You want salpingectomy because you're 22 years old and you want to have many more children. You haven't had any yet.
And then I told him that I don't want to do that. I want to go the other way because I think it's more correct, etc. Can the doctor try to not do that, or would the insurance cover it, or
he could at least have the decency to refer you to a pro-life doctor, to a pro-life OBGYN surgeon, okay? But again,
this is something like this. If I'm already in pain and something that is well, you have a few hours, a few days, even a few weeks of window, okay? It can be managed. It can be managed for some time. It has to be observed. In fact, I'll tell you more. This is what happens, again, clinically, existentially, on the ground. Many tubal pregnancies, ectopic pregnancies, resolve on their own. Oh, really?
Meaning, that the woman may or may not have felt any symptom, but there was indeed an ectopic pregnancy, and early on, that uterus was strong enough to expel that, to repel the invasion of the trophoblast, essentially, and to expel the early embryo. She essentially had an early abortion, a spontaneous abortion. She may not even have realized it, but she was expelling an ectopic pregnancy. Because of nature, nature always tries to do what is the healthy thing, you know, what is hardwired.
I was asking that question because nowadays everything becomes a problem with insurance and, you know, and I was, I'm thinking that potentially that would be an issue with the insurance not covering. Or
not necessarily, because the salpingectomy is still standard medical practice and it's not necessarily that much more expensive. In fact, the salpingostomy, when you think about it, is more of a microsurgery. And could be more dangerous. And also, it's not as effective, right, as in the salpingectomy, because you can leave scarring on the fallopian tube. Then what happens? The next pregnancy, I get an ectopic pregnancy again in the same place, and now I'm going to sue the doctor for malpractice because she didn't do a good job. So this medical malpractice is amazing, and the OBGYNs are getting sued a lot. You know, they have one of the highest insurances in the country because they're so suable. Okay, and the ill intent, unfortunately, is out there on people.
In Florida, are they forced to carry medical insurance? Because
bottom line, I don't know. But I have heard that some doctors are going without insurance altogether, and they just paper their offices with a big sign, I have no insurance, so be my guest, you know, sue me. You're gonna get the sandwich that I ate today or something because I don't have any insurance, and all my goods are placed on my spouse's, on my children's name, so I have nothing to my name.
Wow.
Kind of drastic, but yeah, the practice is expensive. Okay, questions?
There's no way to move the trophoblast from the fallopian tube into the...
Right, so then some theologians have gotten into the issue, the ethical obligation. Do we have an obligation to attempt implantation in the proper place? Again, whether you landed existentially, what is the risk to that child? You know, okay, so you have to scrape out, think of it mechanically, you have to scrape out a blastocyst that is attempting to implant in the fallopian tube without damaging the blastocyst, because if I damage the blastocyst, then I'm interfering directly on the embryo's life, okay?
Can you do a little vacuum?
Yes, you can attempt it and then try to reimplant him or her into the endometrium and hope that he or her implants. But what if that little embryo doesn't implant? Then there's an abortion. That abortion could be read either as spontaneous abortion or it could be read as a procured abortion, because who placed that embryo in the endometrium? That embryo did not go to the endometrium naturally, went through an artificial means. So the mechanical means of placing that embryo into the endometrium may have in fact caused the abortion, and then that's an induced abortion. That's a procured abortion. And so it's a one, and therefore, bottom line, thanks be to God, from the Catholic perspective, we have the principle of double effect, and there's no obligation to seek to implant that embryo in his or her place. Plus, number two, there may be reasons why that embryo got stuck there to begin with, you know, which could be some kind of deformity, which by placing that embryo, implanting that embryo into the uterus, then we're encouraging a deformity that would have been selected out naturally. You know, so we're interfering with natural selection one way or another. Okay, Henry.
But when it comes to the principle of double effect, it's not a universal moral principle, or it's just within the bioethics Catholic moral.
It's universal for anyone wants to use it, but we certainly use it. You know, it's a principle that is based on reason. I have not mentioned God or religion or faith in anything for the principle of double effect. So in principle, a humanist could hold the principle of double effect for humanitarian reasons. It's the best way to proceed when an act has two effects, one good and one bad. And remember that ethics predates Christianity, because the Greeks were doing ethics, you know, as part of philosophy. It's one of the branches of classical philosophy several hundred years before the time of Christ.
So if I try to make an parallel analogy based on this principle, if it all depends on the intention, then if I say, well, we have to drop a bomb in this particular geographic area because we have to eliminate this threat. It's an objective threat to a nation. However, there will be people, innocent people, that will be killed. But my intention is to eliminate the threat.
Right.
Is that
right? So right, you have to be careful because you're basically edging toward what is known as a just war theory, the just war theory. Okay, and it's not quite the principle of double effect because the people who are doing evil things, right, are the ones you want to kill because they're doing evil things in a massive way. For example, let's say Hitler had to be stopped. You know, Hitler had to be stopped. Okay. And so, how to stop it, right? And that could even justify, and in fact, the bombing, the saturation bombing that was going on during the Second World War was killing innocent human beings, okay? And the idea was to stop the massive evil that the Third Reich, that the Nazi regime was expanding, had already taken over Europe and was expanding into Africa. And you know, ever been to Miami Zoo?
Yeah.
This is the extent of the insanity of Adolf Hitler, okay? You go to the Metro Zoo, now it has a different name. There are some tall concrete towers there, all right? Somewhere around there, there are some very tall concrete towers that look kind of awkward. There's also one that going down to the Keys, and that they made Key Largo, they made a relay microwave station at one point, and then had to cancel it because it was affecting the pacemakers of the people living locally. Anyway, that tower is a concrete tower, large and just boxy and empty. That used to be where the Zeppelins, where the blimps lodged, all right, for getting the helium or whatever the gas they were getting. And why did we have blimps in Miami in the 40s? Because those blimps would patrol the coastline in silence, okay, at night. And why would they patrol the coastline of Florida in silence at night and the Keys?
Submarines.
Because the U-boats. Because Hitler was already sending submarines to invade the United States. And there's evidence of Nazi submarines in the Caribbean. There's evidence of Nazi submarines in Florida, and there's evidence that they went into Hudson Bay. The Nazi submarines were already inside Hudson Bay, okay, in New York City. And so he had a plan to invade the US. Remember, the best defensive is an offensive. So he had to be stopped because he was not stopping. In fact, there was a point that the generals, look at, there's some movies, have you seen Valkyrie? Valkyrie is one. Valkyrie. There were about at least a dozen assassination attempts on Adolf Hitler from his generals, from his colonels, whatever the rank, the highest ranking, his immediate cohort of colonels, because they realized the man has just gone off the deep end, right? And more and more military people in the ranks of the Third Reich were questioning themselves, were they sufficiently Aryan? Were they Aryan enough to not be cleansed out? They were going back, they were doing genealogical, all of a sudden they're doing genealogical trees to see if they were Aryan, to see when in their generations was there an African, a Gypsy, a Catholic, a Jew, a homosexual, or someone that was contaminating their line. Okay, because it was getting that schizophrenic.
One of my students is like the most blonde-haired, blue-eyed kid you could ever imagine, and he says he's 4% African.
You see?
He did his DNA.
Yeah,
Like
there you go.
Sierra Leone.
Yeah. And we
So,
have,
you
I
know,
mean,
you can't tell.
we have Neanderthal DNA, for heaven's sakes. How far back can you go? Okay, so yes, he was totally getting it. So the man had to be stopped, all right? Anyway, so the principle applies. So double effect doesn't really apply in that case, okay? What applies instead is what we call the just war theory, which is an extension of the principle of self-defense.
So
I have a right to defend myself against an unjust aggressor, all right? An unjust aggressor. And when that principle is extended to the social level, a nation has a right to defend itself against unjust aggressors. And that's what is known as the just war theory. But then it has two levels. It has the jus in bellum and the jus ad bellum. In other words, the jus in bellum and the jus ad bellum is the justification for going into war, and then the justification for maintaining the war going until the objective is met. You know,
so
there are principles that guide that.
So far, Nagasaki and Hiroshima,
Yes.
are not seen as
Yes.
yeah.
What people don't know, so people know that Nagasaki and Hiroshima killed millions of people. What people don't know is that before the bombing, Nagasaki and Hiroshima were warned, were papered. The whole city was papered with pamphlets saying, get out of here, get out of here, get out of here. Okay? They were warned. So, but still, it was drastic, but it was, and that today is controversial, right? To this day, the atomic bomb was controversial, but it did definitely make a statement. Anyway, so it's a different principle, not the double effect applies mostly on healthcare. But just theory applies, the self-defense applies in unjust aggressions. Some people in the abortion industry have tried to use the unjust aggression for abortion in putting the fetus as an unjust aggressor on the mother. From one perspective, you can see that the fetus is a parasite. It's a temporary parasite, but a parasite nonetheless, because it is sucking from the mother and is contributing nothing supposedly to the mother, or nothing good. In fact, it's suppressing her immune system, and it's just sucking her nutrients, and it's pumping waste into her mother. So from one perspective, the fetus can be considered a parasite. However, if you think of that, you stand back a little further, that is an antagonistic model of placing the fetus against the mother for whatever species. You know, but the premise is that the fetus is antagonistic, all right, which is a false premise. Because the fetus, in fact, you know, moms can give birth and continue living. So moms don't really die from pregnancies normally, right? And so it's not a parasite, it's a host that the mother's body can't tolerate for 9 months without significant damage to her life or health, normally. There are exceptions, and those can be dealt with a double effect. But the point is that to try to use the self-defense to justify an induced abortion, a procured abortion, is placing the fetus as an antagonist to her mother, is placing him or her as an unjust aggressor. But there's no will of the fetus, right? The fetus cannot be an unjust aggressor because that involves the will. An unjust aggressor is, I will do you damage. I will to rape you, I will to kill you, I will to rob you, you know, I am willing the evil. And the fetus cannot will in that sense. You know, a fetus can only will if there's will in the fetus, has to be a developmental will at that stage of the brain, can only will what that brain is capable of willing, which is essentially we have to assume that the fetus just wills to live, you know, and to develop. So always grounding it on what's happening physiologically is very important. Okay? Now, in 15 minutes or less, a brief history of the contraceptive pill. Let's do a little history. It's all history now, okay? But I think it's important, at least from our Judeo-Christian tradition and more specifically from the Catholic perspective, and considering the stand that the Catholic Church takes with regards to contraception, to understand the background to this. And we have to trace it back to Margaret Sanger. Margaret Sanger, who lived from 1879, she was born in 1879, and actually died in 66 in Arizona. She lived over 80 years of age. Margaret was the daughter, she was Higgins by birth. She was the daughter of immigrants, of Irish immigrants, and in a kind of low income class, struggling She was the 6th of 11 siblings, and that's because her mom lost 7 other pregnancies. So her mom had 18 pregnancies in about 22 or 23 years of marriage. So do the math, all right? And Mr. Higgins, essentially, with all due respect, just wouldn't stop. So what happened was that, in fact, the mother died early in her 40s. So what did Margaret see when she was growing up? She saw a lot of hardship and struggle, and she basically had to take care of her other 5 siblings who were younger than her. 11 minus 6, the other 5. Okay, so she had a lot of struggle in her life, and yet she had a good heart, a noble heart, and she eventually went into nursing. She went into nursing in her early 20s. She was already a nurse, and she was going into poor neighborhoods and helping out women, trying to help women. She was already an orphan early on her mother, and perhaps the father was not as present as he could have been, or anyway, the point is that as a child and as a teenager, she went through a lot of struggle. And not only that, she was very perceptive and intelligent, and she saw the struggle around her for immigrants and for poor people and for women, all right? Go back to the late 1800s, early 1900s, in here and in many parts of the world, even to this day. The discrimination, the abuse, the grief that women had to put up with. Of course, contraception was illegal. To talk about contraception was immoral and was unethical and illegal, and you could get arrested and jailed for talking about contraception in public, okay? It was part of the modesty laws that were in this country that were very Victorian and very restrictive, and came out of a mentality, a puritanical mentality also, that was, quite frankly, for today's standard, thinking of the word, of the concept, a misunderstanding of what human sexuality is truly about, okay? Of this life-giving and love-giving. In other words, sexual intercourse was suspect precisely because it was so pleasurable. How can it be right? So the whole mentality of it had to be tolerated for the children, you know, but there was a lot of double standard there. And frankly, what I say is an incomplete anthropology. They just didn't have a real, true understanding of human sexuality and the complementarity of men and women and how it should truly be lived and so forth. And so there was a lot of repression and restriction going on with regards to sexuality, and a lot of the burden fell on the women. On the women because they could not avoid getting pregnant, okay? And so they were even these marital rights that were considered, the conjugal rights. And sadly, even the Catholic Church, unfortunately, before the Second Vatican Council in the 60s, was subject to that kind of mentality. Conjugal rights. Conjugal right essentially meant that the husband had a right to have intercourse with his wife by marriage. The marriage granted the couple the right. Of course, she had the same right too, but who's the one who wanted it all the time? You know, you have to be realistic, because she's cycling, he's not, and so normally he's the one who would want it all the time and not her, especially considering that every 9 months she can get pregnant. And so this is kind of drastic, but it was happening and it was real, and Margaret was living all of this, so she was very, very negatively predisposed toward women getting pregnant, you know, and not having control of the pregnancy. Okay, she also happened to get involved in a humanist world, or the free intellectuals of the time, which were left-leaning, and some were anarchist, others were socialist or communist, and she got involved in that intellectual group, all right, of free thinking that was going on at the end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s. Even the Bolshevik Revolution was going on in Europe was drastic compared to what was going on here. There was also the eugenics movement going on at that time, the building up to the Third Reich of cleansing the population and all this, and the more imperfect. In the 1930s, in the United States, there were government agents going around giving stars, giving prizes to families that were the typical white, blue eye, blonde, with many children. They were giving out prizes to these families. Okay, that was part of the eugenics movement in the United States, and they will go specifically. It was done in the Midwest, in the rural America, just encouraging families to be blonde, blue eye, and so forth, and white for sure. So there was an active eugenics movement going on in the United States in the 30s, which was a spillover from what was happening in Europe, actually. Okay, and this was true. It started in Cold Spring Harbor. To this day, that's a center that is high research and all that, but it has the history of the eugenics that went on there. At any rate, she was influenced by all this, and she was also influenced by the women's vote movement, the suffragists, which of course was a very positive thing in that sense, in that granting the vote to women, all right? So there was a blend in her life of good and bad influences. She became a suffragist, she was very involved in that movement, but she focused more and more on women having an absolute control over their reproduction, okay? And I'm saying reproduction on purpose, not procreation, but reproduction, okay? So sadly, but surely, maybe unconsciously, she fell to a utilitarian mentality. And she realized, maybe because of the immense social pressure at the time, that the only way that women could truly be on equal footing with men and everything else was if women had absolute control over their reproduction. And they could, and that, so she started first with diaphragms and stuff. She would smuggle in, because diaphragms and condoms were against the law in the United States. They were happening in Europe, they were happening in Canada. And one of her ex-husbands, in fact, was smuggling them in through Canada, diaphragms. She got arrested and all this. So she was really pushing, but she was actually pushing for a case, for a legal case, to derrumbar, to knock down the puritanical type of laws, the modesty laws. They were called, it's all under modesty, these modesty laws that were occurring in the United States, okay? So, it's like one extreme to the other extreme. At any rate, eventually she realized that the best way to go was to try to repress ovulation on the woman, because that would do it. If we can prevent the woman from ovulating, we got it, right? Okay, so she started associating with some, and this also came about with her connection, some of her background in nursing, of course. She had some basic understanding of the human body and ovulation and the cycle and all that. So it came down to the biochemistry of it, the hormones, okay? And then she met and was introduced to Gregory Pincus. Pincus was a biologist. He was at Harvard, and he was working in hormones, and he became a specialist in hormones, and he was following the reproductive cycles of animals and so forth, of mammals, and he became an expert in the human reproductive cycle, hormonally speaking, and he started developing some hormones that could suppress ovulation. And the general group is called the progestins, okay? From which we get obviously progesterone, because they're mimicking the natural progesterone of the body. Estrogen is part of that cycle too, as we know. Then at some point it came to trying these hormones out on some patients, right? They needed some patients. They needed to try them out to see if some women could actually suppress their ovulation. Well, along comes John Rock. John Rock was an MD, an OBGYN in Massachusetts, and he had a very, very successful fertility clinic. He was famous. People come to him, women would come from all over the US to his clinic to get pregnant, the ones who were having difficulty. And so he was a pioneer in fertility for women back at the beginning of last century. It happens that he was also a Catholic, a very staunch practicing Catholic. They say that he was a daily communicant, went to Mass every day and had communion. And at the height of his career, Sanger puts these two men together so that John Rock would provide the clinical trials for the progestins that Pincus was developing. Okay, and the original idea, of course, originally was to try to get women to ovulate who were having difficulty, but then the whole thing expanded and exploded into, well, the same chemicals could suppress the ovulation depending on the dosage, so it's a dosage thing. And Rock could benefit in his practice of fertility for enhancing fertility, but also it could also expand in women who didn't want to get pregnant to suppress their fertility. All right, so you see how this has its own evolution. In the meantime, it's still illegal in the United States, so they go abroad for the clinical trials. And they go first to Puerto Rico, because in Puerto Rico, there are already some clinics that were trying to do family planning for women who were getting pregnant all the time and didn't want to get pregnant. So they did some of these trials in Puerto Rico. And you can understand that when this got out, that a chemical, that a little pill, by taking this little pill, I will not get pregnant, okay? Women flocked to these trials. Also back then, there was no IRBs, institutional review boards. The ethics committee were very rudimentary, and there was informed consent was very dubious, and sometimes they weren't even told. Well, they certainly weren't told if they were getting a placebo or getting the actual drug. So many women who went to these trials voluntarily got pregnant. And even knowing that they might get the placebo, but they couldn't be told if they were getting the placebo or not, of course, because that would invalidate the trial, they would risk getting pregnant as long as they had the chance and the opportunity statistically to not get pregnant. Okay? So you can see it's a social issue, it's intense on the women, the pressure is on. So they were flocking these clinics to be part of the trials, okay? Apparently Puerto Rico was not enough, so they needed a second cohort, so they went into Haiti also. Guess what? They're going into the poor neighborhoods. You know, it's a manipulation what's going on here. It's manipulation of women. That was still not enough. They went to Mexico and continued with more trials. And it looks like geographically they're going around in a clockwise direction, because eventually they ended in Los Angeles doing more trials there, probably with immigrants and the poor population, because in the background there's also the eugenists. Remember who's driving this bus? Is Margaret Sanger, who is also a eugenist, all right, and that's documented. And so she was interested in getting the poor people not to breed, in her words. And she had classified, her anthropology was, she had classified people in three categories: the well-to-do, the intelligent, and the poor. All right, and the well-to-do, there was no problem with them, because one way or another they managed not to get pregnant. Okay, they had access to whatever, including clandestine abortions. So the rich and the wealthy didn't have to worry about them, because they knew how to handle their pregnancies. But plus, if you got pregnant, they had money to raise their children anyway, so it wasn't an issue. The intellectual, or the intelligent ones, were the ones who didn't want to get pregnant, the women who didn't want to get pregnant and didn't want to get pregnant, but didn't have the wherewithal to do that. And they understood, they got it, they were responsible, all this. They just did not want to get pregnant, you know, every 9 months or every year. But they didn't have the financial means to be responsible about their pregnancies, okay, about their fertility. And that would be basically like the middle class. And then the poor, who really didn't deserve, I'm kind of paraphrasing, but they didn't deserve to get pregnant because they were poor, they were ignorant, they didn't have means to raise their children and give them an education. And so those people really shouldn't get pregnant. And she would perhaps even espouse or be in favor of a social plan to limit their pregnancy, and that comes the eugenics thing that was being done there to try to discourage the poor, the ignorant, or the minorities from procreating, from reproducing. And the clinics were typically in slum areas, as has been documented, in Black neighborhoods, in Afro-American neighborhoods, and in migrant neighborhoods, and so forth. All right? So that was the active eugenics movement that was going on in the United States back then, and she was part of it. So eventually, these clinical trials are successful in the sense that these doctors got to prove clinically with enough data that these hormones, these progestins, would suppress ovulation in 99% of the cases. Okay, because medicine is a statistical science and a statistical art. All right. So finally, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, which is the one that controls all this, all right? It controls food and drug so that it is healthy for the population. It is the public agency that is in charge of our health, let's say, okay? All right. First came the approval in 1957 of contraceptive of the progestin suppressing ovulation for menstrual disorder. In other words, for women who are not regular. They could, in honesty, ask to regulate their menstrual cycle, all right? Or they could, in dishonesty, ask to regulate the menstrual cycle and get the hormonal suppressor. Because it was still illegal, all right? They had to lie that they were irregular in their cycle, so for health reasons, in other words, to regulate their cycle, they could get the progestins, okay? That was the first approval, the FDA approval was in 1957, and the drug was Enovid. Enovid was the first one. But 3 years later, they kept pushing the envelope stronger and stronger, and those modesty laws kept collapsing more and more, so that eventually the pill was approved by the FDA in 1960. Okay, as a contraceptive. Part of it is the women's rights and all this, but interpreted in this absolute way that I, as a woman, should have absolute control. My body, my choice, right? It's a slogan. So you see, it's not easy, right? It's not easy, it's complicated. Okay. Now, from the Catholic perspective, what's happening at that time? Oh, beyond time, sorry. I'm gonna steal 5 minutes of your time. Okay, from the Catholic perspective, it turns out that in the early 60s, there is the Second Vatican Council. Now, the Second Vatican Council is the largest ecumenical council in the history of the church. Over 3,000 bishops gathered in Rome from the whole world, all right, for 2.5, almost 3 years, from 60C to 65, 1960C to 65. The previous council, which was, of course, Vatican I, okay, was almost 100 years earlier, was just started in 1868 or 69, almost 100 years prior. And it was truncated because Garibaldi, who was an officer of Italy, a military officer, was coming down the peninsula of Italy, conquering the places, was trying to unify the Italian peninsula. There were many kingdoms at that time, even into the 19th century in Italy. And a substantial part of the Italian peninsula actually belonged to the Vatican, belonged to the Catholic Church. They were called extraterritorial territories beyond the Vatican itself. But anyway, part of the unification of Italy meant appropriating and incorporating those extraterritorial sites into the Italian peninsula, into the state of Italy, all right? So certainly Garibaldi was not well seen by the Catholic Church, and when he was getting closer and closer to Rome, Vatican I was going on, and so the Pope and the bishops of the time, which were maybe, I think, about 200 or 300, decided to flee. They fled for their lives, and the Pope actually went across the corridor there on the second story that goes into the round castle, Castel Gandolfo, and locked himself in, and Castel Sant'Angelo, right? The one that has the angel on top in Rome. He locked himself in, he declared himself a prisoner of the state, officially, right? He was there for several popes went through, and eventually, who was it that came out of Castle, no longer declared himself prisoner of the state because the state had not imprisoned him. Anyway, it's historical, it's interesting, it's anecdotal. But the point is that Pope John the 23rd started the council, all right? I think it was April or something like that in the beginning of 1963. And the pill is taking over like wildfire, all right? Within 3 years, in other words, from 60 to 63, literally millions of women were taking the pill throughout the United States. You can follow, it's a classical case in statistics of a geometric progression, exponential. You know, one woman led to 2, 2 led to 4, 4 led to 8, 16, and within a few months, you had an exponential doubling of women taking the pill, first in the US, then Europe, and then throughout the world. And so literally millions of people were taking the pill before really any sophisticated ethical analysis had been done on it, okay? Number one. Number two, the Second Vatican Council, of course, was addressing many issues in the world. You remember, I was born in the early 50s, so I was a child of the 60s with the hippies and the Beatles, and I grew up with all that stuff, and Woodstock. And so there's a lot of revolution. The social revolution was going on, the sexual revolution, any revolution you can think of, we were doing that.
I'm
Okay?
sorry, Father. I just don't picture you as a hippie.
You believe, Deacon Lewis, when I was in high school, first of all, I had hair. It was black, and it was beyond my shoulders, okay? And that's the solemn truth. And when I got a bicycle, I painted flowers on it. So, the Lord has a weird sense of humor, I tell you. Anyway, what is happening? Pope John the 23rd does not want the entire Ecumenical Council, which is addressing so many social issues, okay, and bring them to the church. So the word for the council was aggiornamento. Aggiornamento in Italian means to coming up to date, all right? The Mass in Latin. Please, for heaven's sakes, nobody knows how to speak Latin. They're praying the rosaries during Mass, okay? So it had to be brought up to date. And because this aggiornamento was at stake in the Second Vatican Council, and no one was persecuting them, you know, they could be there, all the significant number of the bishops, of course they took turns, they weren't all there at the same time because they couldn't leave their diocese empty. But it was by far the largest gathering in the Catholic Church in its history. If you say what's the most significant event of the Catholic Church in the last century, in the 20th century, it was the Vatican Council, okay? Because of that, he did not want, the Pope, for the council to be sequestered by this issue of contraception, because it was impacting, certainly it was impacting women, it was impacting marriages, it was impacting family and society, but it was not the only issue, okay? Sexuality is important, but it's not all our lives. And so there were other social issues that were present that had to be addressed. And because he did not want the council to be sequestered by this overwhelming issue, especially by 3,000 celibate men, you know, we're not going to have that much credibility with married women or unmarried women, then he established a commission. He established a commission of known theologians and laity to address the issue, and it was a discrete 6-member commission to study the phenomenon of contraception, which just rose on the horizon and is kind of taking over, all right? Then what does he do? This is Pope John the 23rd, remember? Small, chubby, very joyful, and they say he used to smoke a cigarette every now and then. Well, he dies. He dies like in October at the end of the 1963. The council.
65, I think he died.
No.
Before that?
No, 63. Yeah.
Right after.
Within the year, yeah, after he started it. Like the council started, I think, in April, and he died in October, something like that.
Yeah.
You know, so essentially he left the whole place. So now the council, the church and the Vatican, in the midst of a council, they have to go into a conclave. They have to go, the cardinals have to be sequestered into electing, the College of Cardinals have to elect a new pope in the midst of the ecumenical council going on. I mean, it's bizarre, but, you know, because we are the oldest bureaucracy in the world, they can handle it, and they did it. So the bishops were gathering over here, and the cardinals were gathering over here. Over there, the Sistine Chapel, electing a new pope.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so, who do they elect? They elect Paul VI. Now, Paul VI is the new man in town, also Italian, also from Venice and so forth. But the Pope had the prerogative of shutting down the council, saying, okay, we're done with this, now let's move on to something else. But he didn't. He was very courageous, actually, and continued the council and brought it to fulfillment. And folks, if you want to see politics, there's no bigger politics, a greater politics, and more vicious politics than the politics of the church, okay? Who was it? I think it was John the 23rd also, who had prophesied. This council will go through 3 stages. Said it will go through the stage of man, and then it will go through the stage of the devil, and then it will finally go through the stage of the Holy Spirit. Okay, so the stage of man was getting together and starting the juggling of the different theologies and ideologies and agendas and stuff that was going on. And then the stage of the devil was all the infighting that went on in this council. Okay, precisely because of different agendas, the traditionalists, the liberals, and the in-betweens, and all this. It was going on. And then finally, all of this human nonsense started giving way to the gifts of the Holy Spirit, so that some of the richest documents that we have in the Catholic Church are the documents of the Second Vatican Council. Okay? And they closed in 65. I think they closed it with the Immaculate Conception, precisely the 8th of December of 65. All right, so Paul VI, instead of dissolving this commission, takes it head on and expands it to 72 members. Okay? And that commission finally comes up with a report in 1966, only 3 years later, after going through all that turmoil. So they're moving fast in this issue. Now, the majority, the vast majority of the commission, 60-something, I think that's 65 or 68 of the 72, the majority, a very large, significant majority, in the report said, bottom line, contraception can be justified for certain reasons, for the grave reasons. In other words, there's a level of end and the level of means. In other words, we have to justify the end and we have to justify the means. All right? And the end was the list that I gave you earlier. Too many children, too many this, too many that, not enough money, too much pressure, all these things. This justifies contraception. In other words, this justifies avoiding children. These are grave reasons to justify avoiding children. But the means, it's all about the means, okay? What means can be used? And the conclusion of the majority report of that commission was that contraceptives could be used, considering that there was grave justification, okay? But there were about 4 or 5 who dissented, a very small minority. That small minority was enough to kind of tell the Pope that something is fishy in Denmark. So he goes into deep prayer and into deep reflection, and he finally realizes that contraception goes against the procreative dimension of the 2 dimensions, that is a direct attack on the 2 dimensions of the marital life, and therefore really not justifiable. Not justifiable. So going against the majority of the commission, he writes his own report, if you will, which is that famous encyclical Humanae Vitae, infamous for some people, okay? But he determines that contraception as such, because of the artificiality of the means, that it's artificially interfering with the natural process, is intrinsically evil, okay, and should be avoided. But there are some grave reasons where avoiding children could be justified. But the means, the art of it is about the pill specifically, contraception, okay, or direct sterilization, is vies directly against the procreative dimension and therefore cannot be morally justified. The alternative, and thank God there is an alternative, of course, is natural family planning, which we'll talk about next Saturday, all right? And so here I give you the website, the link for Humanae Vitae in English. For free, you can download it. Most of the documents of the Vatican now are being posted online for free in your favorite language. And what I say is this, read the document. because you wouldn't believe the millions of people that have an opinion about Paul VI and Romani Vitae and how wrong he is and how wrong the encyclical is. Everybody has an opinion on that, how wrong we are on this. And I ask, of those millions of people, how many have actually read the documents? It's 15 pages, And the vast majority of the people who have an opinion have not really read the actual document. And so I say, read the document and maybe we can talk afterwards. Read the document. Read the document, read the document. So the danger of having an opinion is that we haven't read the document. Therefore, I put it there for your consideration, and we'll pick it up next week, hopefully, with natural family planning.
Father, before you close, could you tell us Margaret Sanger's role in abortion?
Right, thank you. So unfortunately, what had happened was that she went further and she established a society, an association for reproductive rights for women and the birth control. She's the one who basically popularized that term of birth control. In other words, she wanted women to have control over their birth, over their body, who they were birthing and when. And so eventually that league or that association that she formed, the Birth Control Association, eventually becomes Planned Parenthood. And they expand into abortion also. In other words, you see, it's consistent with the utilitarian mentality. Even though it's controversial whether Margaret Sanger was actually in favor or against abortion as such, she had had some very negative experiences. As a nurse, she had to take care of a woman twice who had done a self-induced abortion, And of course, it was very messy, it was horrible, she was bleeding to death. The first time, that woman's life was saved. The second time, they couldn't save her. She bled to death. And that had a big impact on her. But at the end of the day, it is assumed that she would, consistent with the utilitarian mentality, then she would be okay with the abortion of that third group. Always of the third group who are incapable, who should not be able, because they're incapable of raising children for whatever reasons, they should be forbidden from having children.
I was actually told that she actually started the first abortion clinic.
It could be, I don't know, I didn't go into that level of detail, but if you just punch in these names, if you Google these names, it will give you more history on them. There's also the letter that she wrote to the Campbell brothers, one of the Campbell brothers when she was Campbell. Procter & Gamble, right?
Yes.
The Campbell brothers, she was looking for funds. She was always looking for funds to do the research. And she wrote a letter to one of the Gamble brothers saying, we don't want word to get out that we want to exterminate the Negro population. I mean, that at first blush sounds drastic. And she did write those words, but then if you put it in the fuller context, it's not exactly what she actually was saying, the opposite. We don't want this word to get out that we want to exterminate the Negro population. In all honesty and fairness, is taking it out of context, because the fuller phrase of that sentence, and I can pull it up for a moment, you'll see what I mean, is that she was trying to get the blacks, bottom line, she was trying to get the blacks not to procreate, because they were a minority, they were incapable of raising their children, they were in a situation of poverty, and they just were too ignorant to raise their children. And society was totally against them. So she was trying to, in that sense, what is known as negative eugenics, which was to eliminate the weaker in society for one reason or another. So, but the quote is here, and therefore it will take me a minute to go to it. That quote in a bigger context is that she wanted to get, she figured out that the way to get to African-American families was through their clergy, through their religion, which, as we know, was mostly Baptist or Protestant and so forth. And so she was trying to get pastors, Protestant pastors or African-American pastors in her, American Birth Control League, which later became Planned Parenthood, etc. But I wanted to get that quote specifically.
There was a Sanger Institute somewhere in
Yes.
London.
Yes, yeah, she went to London. She fled when she was accused of going against the modesty laws. She did not want to go through trial at that point, and so she fled to Great Britain, and that's where she got further influenced by the humanists of the time, the seculars. Oh, she was also influenced. She was a neo-Malthusian. She was Malthus and population growth and limit population to save the environment. That mentality, that again is simplistic, and what it's doing with that mentality, the population control mentality. You've heard of Malthus, which was promoting that we were just too many people on Earth, right? It was embedded in here.
Then you'd have to put your name in on Gamble Brothers if you want to find out later.
But probably just, do the name and
Her name on Gamble Brothers.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
or a
Because I
quote.
want you to see the.
You can put also,
Gamble quote. Let's try that. Right. Let's see if it's part of this.
You sick.
Well, if I want to put the whole quote down, it's important. Oh yeah, a lot of this. Well, I
right,
haven't.
we don't want the word to go out, and we want to.
Yeah, there should be no more babies.
Right, you see, but the 3 points make a big difference.
Yeah.
Exactly. We need the whole thing, okay? And we have to be. Yeah, she even talked to the women of the Ku Klux Klan and all that. So, you know, it's known. She was a suffragist. She was a eugenicist. She was a secularist, free thinker. She blamed Christianity for overpopulation. So all those things are there. Okay, but it's not giving me the quote, the full quote. We don't allow intent. We don't want a word to get out. Yeah.
Just our terminology is
Right.
oh my God. That's right, Father. We understand what you say when you say that.
Do Control F and then search for the quote.
Okay, Control F.
Put your name and stuff in my
Oh,
phone
sure.
somewhere.
I'm sure it's in here. Okay.
It's like
Usually,
it's like where you just get food and drinks, but you have to have a special ticket for it.
I don't know what. I know the tickets you get is what those tickets you get from them. I don't know about that. I'll ask. When you call it.
Should I put it in the text?
Put your name on it, because I have to give it. He's gonna leave you tickets for your pickup. We'll call. That's where you use them. Usually the tickets you get to is.
I put the air traffic tickets in parentheses like that. Is that okay? So I think it's a different ticket.
No, I want you to send this to me. I need you. Yeah, because I need your information to give you.
Oh,
You see.
okay. So
So put it with your number, with your phone number.
okay.
I'll
state my information here.
The user information, the tickets that he gets is like what the players get.
Gotcha. Oh wow, that'd be good.
Yeah. So, because he knows those guys, hey, got a couple tickets, I need to.
Cool.
There we go.
And then he leaves it for you to call.
I'll text it to you here. I saved my information. That's me, John Maxim.
Okay.
I'll save it there. Thank you, Deacon Lewis.
But not that.
Okay, so, and the reason why I'm making this effort, is because I have used this quote in the past, okay, but it's truly unfair, at least for the quote itself. And the quote is, we should hire 3 or 4 colored ministers, preferably with social service backgrounds and with engaging personalities. The most successful educational approach to the Negro is through a religious appeal. We don't want the word to go out that we want to exterminate the Negro population.
Okay.
And the minister is the man who can straighten out that idea if it ever occurs to any one of their more rebellious members. Okay?
Yeah.
So really it flips it around.
Sure.
Okay? So in fairness, we have to, but we get, of course, just this phrase. We take this phrase, that's very powerful by itself,
Yeah.
right?
It's terrifying.
Yes. Okay. However, further back in the background, in the bigger picture, for whatever reasons she had, she really believed that there was a certain class of the population that should not breed. They should not be allowed to breed because they were incapable, unworthy of breeding. They didn't have the wherewithal to raise their children properly. Okay. Okay, folks. So to this day, that's what we have. And that's what I have to say for now on this issue.
February
All right.
24.
Great. So again, we'll meet again here next time. And we'll go through. Yes, yes.
What
Next
is
Saturday.
the top on,
Okay, it's in 2 weeks. So I didn't have a chance to talk about it this week. Oh, and if you give me a minute, I have some stuff for you. Let me just pause here. John, I have homework for you. I have some homeworks for you. Don't leave for a moment, please. Okay, stop recording.